Hey guys, tonight we take a journey to a time long ago, to a world full of powerful gods and mythological creatures, where divine drama ruled the day, and immortality was just another part of life. But what if, just for a moment, the gods decided to take a break? No thunderbolts, no plagues, no meddling in mortal affairs, just a little vacation. You might be wondering, can gods actually take time off? And what happens when they do? Well, get ready to drift into a quiet, mythical world where even the gods need a break. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world, so drop a comment if you feel like it. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this: it's been centuries since the gods of Mount Olympus have had any real downtime. They've been busy overseeing the world of mortals, getting involved in wars, loving, hating, and always making dramatic entrances when least expected. But every now and then, even the gods need to step away. And in the great mythological universe, there came a time when the gods decided to take a break from their immortal duties. But why? What could have possibly led to this break? And what would the world look like without their intervention? For as long as anyone could remember, the gods were never far from mortal affairs. Zeus would thunder down with lightning bolts to settle disputes. Hera would cause havoc when her jealousy flared, and Apollo would strike down anyone who dared to disrespect his art. But it wasn't always like this. There were times in myth where the gods took a step back, and when they did, things got interesting. Imagine a time when Zeus decided to take a week off from controlling the heavens, or when Athena wasn't around to guide the heroes. What would happen to the mortal world without their divine meddling? Historians still argue whether this was a planned vacation or just an accidental retreat. Some myths suggest that the gods simply needed a break from their exhausting roles as rulers of both the mortal and immortal worlds. It's not like their lives were simple. On top of managing the earth, sea, and skies, they had family drama and rivalries to contend with. You probably need a vacation too, right? But here's where it gets interesting. The mortals, those who had relied on their divine patrons for help, guidance, and protection, suddenly found themselves on their own. Without divine guidance, how would the mortals fare? Would the absence of the gods lead to peace? Or would chaos ensue? You may think that without the gods, the world would have been a lot more peaceful. But let me tell you, it wasn't as simple as that. It's like having a bunch of kids at a daycare with no teacher. Things can get out of hand fast. With no one to protect them from the whims of fate or other supernatural forces, the mortal world was in for quite a ride. But don't get too comfortable. This break for the gods wasn't a permanent escape. As we'll see, their time away didn't last long, and when they returned, things had changed. Maybe not for the better, but certainly for the more chaotic. The world of mortals had found its own way to cope without their divine protectors, but not necessarily in the way anyone expected. The gods were needed more than they realized. So, now that we know the gods decided to take a break, let's dive into why they even needed time off in the first place. These aren't just any ordinary beings. They're mortals with powers that could reshape the entire world. They were the ones who created storms, birthed new creatures, and sometimes even altered the course of entire civilizations. With that kind of responsibility, it's no surprise that they eventually needed to step back and catch their breath. Imagine the constant pressure. Zeus, king of the gods, had the heavens and earth to manage. When he wasn't keeping his siblings in check or handling mortal rebellions, he was busy fathering children all over the place, each of whom might end up being an inconvenient reminder of his various extramarital escapades. And Hera, his wife, was often left dealing with the fallout. Her time was spent orchestrating complicated schemes of revenge against Zeus' lovers and their offspring. It's no wonder she occasionally needed a moment to breathe. Right. Then there's Poseidon, god of the sea, who was constantly being summoned by sailors to calm the waves or give them favorable winds. His responsibilities stretched from the deepest trenches of the ocean to the most turbulent storms above the waves. How could anyone stay sane under that kind of pressure, knowing that each time a ship sailed, they might be at the mercy of Poseidon's mood? And we haven't even touched on Athena, goddess of wisdom, who was constantly guiding heroes, fighting off evil monsters, and making sure Greece's greatest warriors weren't being completely reckless. Or Apollo, who was busy with both healing and inspiring the arts, while Artemis was doing her best to keep the wildlife safe and the hunters in check. Now, don't get me wrong, these gods had their perks. Immortal, powerful, and seemingly untouchable, they were at the top of the food chain. But their work didn't stop, ever. It's like being the CEO of a universe that never sleeps, constantly on call, no matter the time, no matter the issue. So, it's easy to imagine that there were times when they just needed a break, a little vacation. Even gods deserve it, right? Historians still argue whether the gods' break was a calculated move to rest and recalibrate, or whether it was just a result of cosmic burnout. Did the gods see this time off as a way to recharge and reflect on their impact on the mortal world? Or was it simply that they were tired of the constant hustle and bustle of divine life? And what does a break look like for an immortal? It's not like they could just head to a beach somewhere and sip cocktails. No, their time off was less about relaxing in the conventional sense and more about stepping back from their usual divine duties. They probably still needed some form of recreation to break the monotony. Think of it as their version of taking a sabbatical, time away from the cosmic responsibilities to refresh themselves. For example, some myths suggest that while the gods took their break, they still visited their favorite sanctuaries. Mount Parnassus was one such place where they might retreat, surrounded by the beauty of nature, free from the pressures of ruling the cosmos. But even then, you have to ask, what was happening back on Olympus while they were gone? Were things really peaceful? Or was there a sense of anarchy among the gods' absence? It's as if they had to step away from their duties to understand how much chaos would unfold in their absence. The balance of the world and the stability that they usually provided were now in the hands of those who weren't quite as prepared to rule, like the mortal heroes, or, let's face it, the occasional minor god who was only ever called up when a major god was otherwise occupied. If you think about it, the gods might have even appreciated the quiet for a moment. No urgent prayers from mortals, no bickering among the Olympians. They could simply exist without the weight of divinity constantly pushing them to intervene in every mortal decision or cosmic drama. After all, even a god deserves a break, right? But the real question is, could the gods really afford this break? What would happen to Olympus without its powerful rulers? Historians still argue over this very point. Did the gods ever truly step away? Or was their vacation just a momentary escape that left the world teetering on the edge of imbalance? You see, even immortals like the gods may have needed to rest, but when you have power that vast, it's hard to truly turn it off. The world continues to turn, and the mortals continue their lives, sometimes in ways that the gods might not have predicted. With the gods taking their well-deserved break from Olympus, we're left wondering what the mortal world would look like in their absence. You can almost picture it. Ordinary humans going about their daily lives without the watchful eyes of Zeus or Hera looming above them. No divine guidance, no timely interventions, and certainly no one around to punish mortals for slight offenses. But perhaps, just maybe, without the gods pulling all the strings, there was a chance for things to go on without their constant interference. The gods weren't just managing their own affairs, they were keeping a very close eye on mortal lives. When things went wrong, the gods were there, whether to help or punish. They weren't exactly known for sitting idle by. Even a minor slight could trigger the wrath of Hera, or worse, the vengeance of Zeus. Imagine the surprise of the mortals when the gods simply stopped showing up. No lightning bolts to strike down a transgressor, no monsters sent to punish wrongdoers, and no prophecies to guide the heroes. One of the first things that happens when the gods are gone is the freedom it grants the mortals. For the first time in centuries, Humans no longer have to live in fear of divine retribution. There's no more praying for intervention before a big battle or making sacrifices to appease the gods for good fortune. It must have been an unusual relief. Don't you think, for once, they could act without wondering whether a god was pulling the strings behind the scenes? But, while mortals might have found a momentary sense of freedom, it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. There was no longer anyone to ensure that the seasons would change on time, or that crops would grow in the spring. People still depended on the gods for their harvests, for good weather, and for victory in battle. Without divine interference, there were certainly some cracks that began to show. Sure, they could go about their lives without the pressure of appeasing the gods, but the world itself still ran on cosmic rules. And, without the gods to maintain balance, who would step in to keep the mortal world functioning smoothly? Some mortals, like the heroes of Greek myths, likely thrive during this time. Without gods interfering, they could act freely, pushing forward with their own ambitions. Heroes like Hercules might have found themselves with even more opportunities to prove their strength and valor. There were no more divine beings constantly showing up to aid or hinder them, leaving room for mortals to carve out their destinies, for better or worse. Then there were the more ordinary people, farmers, merchants, soldiers, those who relied on the gods for small favors like good crops or a safe journey, now had to manage on their own. It was probably a time of uncertainty for many. Without the gods to guide them, the unpredictability of nature became more real. What if the weather didn't cooperate with the crops? What if the harvest failed and the gods didn't come to help? In a time when mortality was fragile, this was more than just an inconvenience. It was a real challenge. Historians still argue about the balance between fate and free will in ancient Greek thought. Were mortals truly in charge of their own destinies when they were so often at the mercy of the gods? Did their lives really unfold based on their actions, or were the gods simply letting them go on, pretending to have autonomy? With the gods on vacation, this balance became even murkier. With no one intervening from above, it was up to the mortals to see how they could survive, adapt, and thrive in a world that was suddenly much more unpredictable. And let's not forget the other gods who might have been less enthusiastic about the idea of a break. While the Olympian gods took their time off, their followers and worshippers, those mortals who depended on their divine protection, would have noticed their absence. Take Demeter, goddess of the harvest, for example. If she decided to rest and not bless the fields with a bountiful harvest, what would the mortals do? Or what about Poseidon? Without his blessings, storms could have raged uncontrolled, causing chaos on the seas. Was this break really in the best interest of the mortal world? Or was it creating a kind of divine chaos that left the world uncertain and unpredictable? The absence of the gods also raised an interesting question. What would happen if the mortal world started to question the gods' power? Without the divine interruptions, mortals might begin to feel a sense of independence, a feeling that they could manage their lives without divine aid. If the gods didn't intervene during this time, perhaps mortals would start to doubt the gods' authority, or worse, their relevance. After all, how could a deity who wasn't around to help in times of need remain in control? Historians still debate whether the break from Olympus weakened the gods' influence over mortal lives. Was it the best time for mortals to realize their autonomy, or was it a dangerous moment of rebellion? You might wonder, did the gods even notice their absence? If they were taking a break from their divine duties, did they care about the results of their absence? The gods, though powerful, were hardly perfect. They often acted out of selfishness, jealousy, or sheer boredom, creating turmoil even among themselves. But for once, the world seemed to go on without their constant interference. It was a strange moment for the gods, and perhaps they learned something about the world they ruled, about how fragile or resilient it truly was without them. Historians often discuss whether the gods ever actually needed to take a break from Olympus. Was their time off part of some grand plan, or was it simply the result of cosmic fatigue? Whatever the reason, it marked a unique period in mythological history, one where the gods stepped back, and the mortal world had to figure out how to thrive without them. Now, imagine for a moment that you're a mortal living in this world where the gods have taken a break from Olympus. What does life look like? The gods, once the ultimate authority, now seem to be on vacation. No longer do you need to sacrifice the finest grain, pour wine for Zeus, or burn incense for Hera in hopes of divine favor. It's quiet, a bit too quiet. You've been free from the constant anxiety of trying to please the gods. But in this new world, without their intervention, things start to feel oddly empty. Without their divine oversight, mortals were left to fend for themselves. No Zeus swooping down to bless your harvest, no Apollo ensuring your music is on tune, no Athena offering a handy bit of wisdom when you're about to make a life-altering decision. The world started to feel just a bit more uncertain. And it's not just the gods who have vanished. The entire divine structure that organized society, everything from social norms to legal matters, starts to crumble a bit. There's a sense that, with the gods gone, no one is holding the reins anymore. It's like a cosmic traffic jam, and no one knows who should get to the front of the line. But you might wonder, how do humans handle their freedom? Do they take this opportunity to create a better world, free of divine meddling? Or do they begin to spiral into chaos? If you've ever found yourself wishing for a little less guidance, less interference in your life, this is your chance to imagine it. But, as any good Greek myth reminds us, too much freedom can often lead to unintended consequences. Let's think about the ancient Greek pantheon for a moment. The gods were not exactly the most organized team. Sure, they ran Olympus, but they also played favorites, acted out of jealousy, and caused huge messes whenever they felt like it. But, whether they were meddling or not, they kept order in a world that otherwise seemed prone to chaos. When they stepped back, the natural world was still functioning, the sun rose, the crops grew, and the ocean still waved, but there were no promises. With no divine contracts guaranteeing a good harvest or a sunny day, the chaos started to build up. Think about it. What would it be like to be a farmer during this time? Before the gods took their break, you would have made offerings to Demeter, hoping for a bountiful harvest. You might have gone to the temple to ask Poseidon for calm seas before you set sail. But now, there's no divine guarantee that your crops will grow or that you won't be caught in a violent storm. The natural world hasn't stopped, but without the gods to balance it, everything feels a little more fragile. Take Athenian society, for example. Athens was known for its sophisticated political structure, but it wasn't just about the laws. They believed the gods helped maintain the city's success. Without divine favor, could Athens maintain its position of power and enlightenment? Could democracy continue to thrive without the watchful eyes of the gods? The gods were believed to be patrons of certain cities, and Athens was no exception. If the gods weren't around to offer their approval, could Athens still rise to prominence, or was its fate tied to the gods' whims? Historians still argue whether Greek society would have functioned better or worse without constant divine interference. Some believe the gods' occasional meddling kept the mortals humble and ensured that the gods didn't forget their own influence over the mortal realm. Others argue that, without the gods' intervention, there would have been more space for human achievement, free from divine favoritism. It's an interesting debate, as it suggests that the Greeks might have had a complicated relationship with their gods. They needed them, but at the same time, they might have preferred a little more space to make their own decisions. And it's not just the organized city-states like Athens and Sparta that had to deal with the fallout of a godless world. What about the smaller, more rural villages, where gods like Pan or Artemis held sway? With no divine guidance, the lives of these villagers would become less predictable. Was the absence of gods a chance for them to develop their own ways of life, or did it spell disaster? If you were a simple villager, working the fields and raising your family, would you miss the gods, or would you see this as an opportunity to live life on your own terms? Without the gods, the rituals that governed daily life began to lose their meaning. The sacrifices once made to the gods, now obsolete, left gaps in the lives of the people. No one was there to accept the offerings, No one was there to listen to the prayers. So, what did they do instead? Did they find other ways to deal with the natural chaos that still affected them, or did they resort to other forms of belief, rituals, and even superstition? As the gods took their break, a few mortals tried to step up, filling in where the divine left gaps. Some claimed to speak to the gods or perform rituals that mimicked the old ways. A few even tried to interpret omens and signs in the natural world, like birds or the wind, to understand what was happening in their lives. Still, others began to explore new forms of spirituality, questioning the old gods and offering alternative explanations for life's mysteries. Historians still argue whether the gods' absence during this time was a moment of progress or a step backward. Did the mortals gain freedom, or did they simply lose direction? Some argue that the gods' absence allowed mortals to take control of their own fate, while others say that the break led to spiritual confusion and loss of cultural identity. One thing is certain: the absence of the gods was a significant moment in history, a turning point that left a lasting impact on the mortal world. So, what did it actually look like when the gods took their extended break? Imagine yourself walking through a bustling Athenian marketplace or perhaps a small village in the hills of Greece. You'd see farmers at work, potters shaping clay, and merchants shouting their wares. But now, there's a subtle shift. There's no one making offerings to Zeus or Demeter. The altars are a little quieter, the temples not as crowded with desperate supplicants hoping for divine favor. Without their intervention, the gods who once wielded such enormous influence over everyday life now felt almost like distant memories. The world around you continues, yet there's a lingering uncertainty in the air, a kind of cosmic quiet. And as you move through the streets, you might notice the little ways this absence affects things. The weather might be unpredictable, crops aren't growing with the same consistency, and for the first time, the gods' frequent visits to help or hinder mortal plans are absent. It's not as if the world is falling apart. No, the sun still rises, the sea still waves, but without the gods providing that divine structure, there's an unsettling awareness of how much was actually dependent on them. But here's the catch: the absence of the gods doesn't mean the mortals are entirely lost. The reality is that they now have to step up in ways they never had before. With no divine interventions to rely on, humans start to make their own rules, creating new systems of understanding and governance. They don't exactly throw the old ways out, but they adapt. Political life starts to shift, and new philosophies emerge as thinkers debate what truly governs the world: gods, or the natural laws that exist independently of them. Take Athens, for example, a city that had long been under the patronage of Athena, the goddess of wisdom and strategic warfare. Athena had watched over the city's rise, guiding its generals, inspiring its philosophers, and strengthening its defenses. But without her, Athens suddenly faced new challenges. It was no longer about honoring the gods to secure victory. It became about strategy, knowledge, and human achievement. With no divine goddess to guarantee success, the Athenians began to rely more on their intellect and ability to reason. Historians still argue whether Athens' rise to prominence was due more to Athena's protection or the city's inherent political systems. Some suggest that the philosophical and intellectual golden age that Athens experienced came precisely because of the gods' absence, leaving room for mortal minds like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle to flourish. Others believe that the gods, particularly Athena, were critical to their success, providing a layer of divine favor that reinforced Athens' power. In any case, it's clear that the mortals began to see themselves as more autonomous, more self-reliant. Philosophy, science, and arts began to thrive in ways they hadn't before. If the gods weren't watching over them, it was up to humans to make sense of the world. It wasn't that they completely abandoned their gods, but the reliance on divine intervention began to fade, slowly replaced by faith in human wisdom and achievement. Even in the fields, where agriculture and farming were once entirely reliant on the gods' blessings, something changed. The people, especially in rural areas, began to take control of their own future. They experimented more with techniques for irrigation, crop rotation, and even animal husbandry. They started relying on practical knowledge and passed down methods instead of waiting for a sign from Demeter herself. This wasn't to say that the gods were completely irrelevant. They were still a part of everyday life, but their absence opened a window for human progress in ways that hadn't been seen before. But there's also a darker side to this shift. While it freed people from the fear of angering the gods, it also created uncertainty. No longer were there divine promises of safety. Warriors fighting in battle might not have Athena's protection, and farmers might see their crops fail with no Demeter to bless the fields. This new world where mortals took on the responsibility for their own fate created an atmosphere of tension between self-reliance and the old dependence on the gods. And this tension bred new kinds of thinking, new ideologies, and even new kinds of worship. Some began to turn to more obscure or local gods, while others pushed against the old myths entirely, trying to forge a new path in an increasingly uncertain world. It's worth mentioning that during this time, some mortals began to argue about the nature of the gods altogether. Skepticism toward divine intervention was on the rise, and questions about the gods' involvement in mortal affairs became more common. Mortals weren't just trying to live without their intervention. They were starting to ask whether the gods should have so much influence at all. Philosophers like Epicurus and Heraclitus questioned whether the gods cared for humans or whether they were simply distant, uncaring figures, uninterested in human suffering. The gods' absence allowed for the growth of these ideas, but it also led to the rise of a more self-aware, introspective form of thought that rejected divine determinism. Historians still debate whether this shift in thinking was inevitable or whether it was only possible because the gods took a break. Some suggest that the gods' absence was the spark for this new mode of thinking, while others argue that the seeds for this kind of philosophical revolution were already there, waiting to be nurtured. But one thing is clear: whether it was the absence of divine intervention or the gradual change in mortal understanding, the world was beginning to move away from the idea that the gods controlled everything. Mortals were beginning to control their own destinies, and the power of the gods over human affairs was no longer as absolute. As the mortals adapted to this new reality without the direct influence of the gods, something interesting began to happen. People were no longer waiting for divine signs or intervention. Instead, they started looking inward, seeking answers in their own actions and wisdom. It was as if the absence of the gods triggered an awakening in mortal societies. While they still honored their deities, the gods were becoming less and less central to the lives of the people, who began to rely more heavily on their own strengths, intellect, and creativity. In cities like Athens, this shift had profound cultural implications. The emphasis on philosophy, rhetoric, and human reason became more pronounced. Thinkers like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle began to challenge the idea that the gods controlled the world, offering instead a worldview where humans were at the center of understanding the universe. Without the gods constantly intervening, philosophers argued that humans could use logic and reason to navigate life's challenges. Knowledge, in this new world, was no longer seen as something bestowed by the gods, but something to be discovered through thought, inquiry, and exploration. Of course, the gods weren't entirely absent. They were still a significant part of Greek mythology and culture. Temples remained, and festivals continued. Yet, without the constant pressure of divine expectations, mortals felt a kind of freedom. Heroes, who were once defined by their relationships with the gods, were now seen as self-made, able to achieve greatness without the gods' constant help or interference. The legendary heroes of myth, like Hercules or Perseus, now seem to embody not just divine favor, but human strength and resilience. They were still guided by the gods in their stories, but their success was often a reflection of their own courage and perseverance. Historians still debate how much the gods' absence truly influenced these philosophical shifts. Some argue that it was a gradual evolution of Greek thought that was always there, just waiting for the right moment to emerge. Others suggest that the gods' temporary retreat created a space for humans to explore new ideas, free from divine judgment. Either way, it's clear that the break from Olympus allowed the mortal world to shift in ways that might have been impossible if the gods had remained constantly involved. In a way, the gods' absence didn't just free the people from their control, it opened the door to an entirely new way of thinking. But while intellectual life flourished in some regions, not everyone embraced the idea of living without the gods. For others, the gods' absence created fear and uncertainty. People who had once relied on divine intervention for everything, from successful harvests to protection in battle, were suddenly left to face the world on their own. The gods had been the ultimate security blanket, offering comfort in the form of power over nature, fortune, and fate. Without them, there was a sense of vulnerability that couldn't be easily ignored. Take, for example, the farmers. In a world where agriculture was dependent on the whims of the gods, whether it was Demeter for the harvest or Poseidon for favorable seas, without these divine patrons, there was a creeping anxiety about what would come next. Would the crops grow? Would there be enough food to feed the growing population? Without the gods to ensure their success, it was up to the people themselves to figure out how to survive, leading to new agricultural practices and innovation. Mortals turned their focus from pleasing the gods to perfecting techniques for irrigation, crop rotation, and storage. While it may have been born out of necessity, this new self-reliance laid the groundwork for the practical advancements that came later. And then there were the sailors. Without Poseidon's blessings, how could they ensure their safety on the open sea? With no divine guarantee of calm waters or favorable winds, the sea became an even greater threat. Sailors began to rely more on their skills and experience rather than hoping for divine favor. Some even began to turn to other figures of protection, like minor sea gods or nymphs, but the absence of Poseidon left them with a profound sense of vulnerability. Historians still argue whether this sense of vulnerability was a direct result of the gods' absence or whether it was just part of the ongoing unpredictability of nature. The idea that the gods could control the sea, the harvest, or even the weather had given people a sense of stability. Without them, that stability was shaken, and mortals had to come to terms with the harsh reality that they were alone in the universe, at least for a time. It was an unsettling feeling for many, especially those who had relied on divine favor to get by. Yet, despite the anxiety and the uncertainty, there was a remarkable shift in how people viewed their world. With the gods no longer pulling the strings, people began to turn inward, focusing more on human potential. New schools of thought emerged, emphasizing human agency over divine intervention. Socrates, for instance, encouraged people to look within themselves for wisdom, urging them to understand their own moral compass rather than relying on the gods for guidance. In a sense, the absence of the gods gave birth to a kind of self-sufficiency that would define much of Greek philosophy going forward. Historians still debate whether the gods' absence pushed Greek culture forward or held it back. On the one hand, it may have fueled intellectual growth by forcing mortals to rely on their own minds. On the other hand, it may have left the people spiritually adrift as they grappled with the absence of the divine. Either way, the period without the gods marked a time of introspection, innovation, and, perhaps, most importantly, human growth. As mortals in the Greek world adapted to life without their omnipotent gods, there was a palpable shift in the way they saw themselves and their place in the universe. The absence of the gods left an undeniable gap, one that forced the human world to reckon with its own limits. It wasn't just the practical concerns, no more divine intervention for bountiful harvests or victory in battle. It was something deeper. The gods, while often harsh and unpredictable, provided a kind of structure to the chaos of existence. Without them, everything felt just a little bit more uncertain. Yet, in this void, the mortals didn't collapse into despair. No, they grew stronger, more independent. Some might say that they were simply adapting to the environment, but others might argue that, for the first time, they were actually beginning to understand their own potential. This period of divine absence encouraged a kind of self-reliance that hadn't been there before. No longer were mortals solely dependent on divine favor. Instead, they began to look inward, drawing on their own creativity, intelligence, and strength. In the absence of the gods, humans began to realize that they were capable of more than just waiting for divine favor to bless them. They started to build, innovate, and shape their own destiny. Think about how this must have felt for the average person. Without Zeus's thunderbolts to mete out justice, or Apollo's hand to guide the arts, the weight of responsibility fell squarely on their shoulders. It must have been a little frightening, yet incredibly empowering. Historians often wonder whether this shift marked the birth of modern humanism, a belief that humans, by their own efforts, could shape their future. In the absence of the gods, mortals had no choice but to take the reins. And what followed this period of godlessness? The birth of some of the most profound philosophical, artistic, and political advancements the world had ever seen. It was the beginning of intellectual revolutions that challenged the idea that the gods were the ultimate force driving existence. Instead, human beings could shape their own fates, their own understanding of the world. Let's take a moment to think about some of the more well-known philosophers of the time, particularly in Athens. Socrates, for example, encouraged individuals to look within themselves for wisdom, famously declaring that an unexamined life is not worth living. For Socrates, this was more than just a personal philosophy. It was a rallying cry against the blind obedience to the gods that had once defined Greek culture. His philosophy wasn't about divine intervention. It was about human reason. He believed that by examining one's own life, by questioning the established order, and by understanding oneself, individuals could achieve greater wisdom than any god might offer. Historians still argue whether Socrates' philosophy was a result of divine absence or simply a natural evolution of Greek thought. Some believe that his ideas were deeply influenced by the lack of divine support during this time, while others argue that Socrates was simply building on centuries of philosophical tradition. Regardless of the origin, the absence of the gods allowed the rise of such radical new ideas that encouraged people to think beyond divine will. At the same time, Athens wasn't the only place where this shift in thinking occurred. Other regions of Greece, and indeed other parts of the ancient world, were also beginning to question the gods and explore alternative ways of understanding existence. In the absence of the gods, many philosophers began to focus on natural explanations for the phenomena that once might have been attributed to divine intervention. In the face of this uncertainty, mortals weren't turning to superstition for answers. They were turning to logic, reason, and observation. And what about the arts? With no more direct divine inspiration from Apollo, artists and musicians were now finding their own sources of creativity. Instead of waiting for the gods to dictate the direction of art, they began to explore human experience, human emotion, and the human form in ways that were previously unimagined. The absence of divine instruction gave room for the flourishing of human expression. Take a moment to imagine the great sculptors of this time, like Phidias, who created the colossal statue of Zeus at Olympia. Without the gods constantly watching, how did the artists of the time find inspiration? They turned inward, exploring the depths of human beauty and emotion, creating works of art that were not just tributes to the gods, but also celebrations of the human experience. The gods may have taken a break, but the creative spirit of humanity surged forward in their absence. Of course, not all mortals responded to the gods' vacation with a sense of intellectual enlightenment or creative flourishing. There were those who were frightened by the lack of divine protection. For them, the absence of the gods represented a world of chaos and danger, where even the smallest mistake could lead to catastrophe. These mortals were likely still clinging to the old beliefs, hoping for some sign that the gods would return and restore order. Without the gods' clear direction, it was easy to feel lost in a world that suddenly seemed much larger and more unpredictable. Historians still argue about the role of fear in this period. Did the absence of the gods lead to an increased sense of panic and superstition among some people, or did it foster an era of greater freedom and exploration? It seems likely that both responses existed simultaneously, as humans have always had a complicated relationship with uncertainty. For some, the lack of divine oversight was liberating. For others, it was unsettling. What's clear is that the absence of the gods didn't just leave a void, it forced mortals to grapple with their own place in the world, to recognize their own power and responsibility. As the gods took their break, mortals began to question their dependency on divine intervention and started to shape their own understanding of the world. In this way, the gods' absence wasn't just a break from divine tyranny, it was a moment of growth and transition for the mortal world, a time when humans began to see themselves not as subjects of the gods, but as individuals with the power to influence their own destinies. With the gods taking their extended break, we're left with the curious question: how did the world adjust without their ever-watchful eyes and hands pulling the strings of fate? Mortals, once subjugated to divine whims and subject to the occasional thunderbolt from Zeus or fiery wrath from Hera, now had a chance to live without that looming influence. It's almost as if the gods' absence let the mortal world breathe, but was that breath one of freedom or chaos? The answer is likely somewhere in between. The absence of divine interference gave mortals an odd sense of both liberation and vulnerability. For the first time in ages, they could go about their lives without worrying that one slight would send a god into a jealous rage, or that their fate was bound up in the god's latest whim. No longer did the mortal world revolve around making offerings to appease divine tempers or asking for divine favor in times of trouble. Instead, humans could control their own destinies, make their own decisions, and forge ahead without fearing that some god would come crashing into their lives uninvited. But with that newfound power came a lack of certainty, and that uncertainty caused anxiety in many. Without the gods to guide them, some began to feel lost, unable to make sense of the world. The old ways of life were built on the assumption that divine favor and wrath shaped every moment of mortal existence. Without that, how did one navigate the world? How could a mortal find their way when there was no divine light shining down on them? This led to the rise of new forms of belief, thought, and philosophy. For some, the absence of the gods was a chance to think for themselves, to create new ideologies that didn't depend on divine intervention. It was a time when thinkers like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle found their intellectual footing, pushing for a world governed by reason, ethics, and human logic, rather than divine decrees. In their world, morality and knowledge didn't come from divine commandments, they came from within, from human understanding. And for the first time, philosophy could exist without the looming presence of the gods. Of course, the gods hadn't disappeared entirely. They were still very much a part of Greek mythology, woven into the fabric of cultural rituals and traditions. Temples still stood, and sacrifices were made, but they became less about appeasing the gods and more about honoring the past, maintaining tradition, and perhaps remembering a time when the gods actively shaped their lives. Mortals still kept the gods in their minds, but their influence had waned in the everyday lives of most Greeks. However, as the mortals adjusted to this new reality, they also found new ways to fill the void left by the gods. Instead of divine guidance, they began to look inward and search for answers in their own abilities. For instance, the gods had always been the origin of creativity. Apollo inspired the arts, Athena offered wisdom for strategy, and Hephaestus forged incredible creations. Without these divine inspirations, mortals began to push forward on their own. Musicians, sculptors, and poets now looked to human experience for inspiration, rather than waiting for the gods to bless them with divine creativity. They created new art forms and new ways of thinking about beauty, both human and divine. But it wasn't just art that began to evolve. In the absence of divine intervention, politics and governance also began to take new shapes. City-states like Athens had long been influenced by gods, with deities like Athena being considered the protector of the city. Without Athena's watchful gaze, how would the people of Athens manage their affairs? Would democracy survive without the goddess' favor? This uncertainty pushed Athenians to focus on human abilities, reason, debate, and law, as the foundations of governance. Historians still debate whether this shift in focus from divine guidance to human reason was a natural evolution or whether it was purely a result of divine absence. Some suggest that intellectual movements like the birth of democracy and philosophy would have emerged eventually, regardless of the God's break. Others argue that the absence of divine involvement acted as a kind of catalyst for the intellectual evolution that followed, sparking new ways of thinking that wouldn't have been possible had the gods remained as omnipresent forces. Yet, there were those who were not so quick to adapt to this new worldview. They still turned to the gods, hoping that their divine patrons would return. Perhaps they felt lost without the gods, or perhaps they saw their absence as a test, a challenge to their faith. So, while philosophers and intellectuals were starting to question divine authority, the general populace, especially those who had always depended on the gods for their safety, prosperity, and guidance, weren't so eager to let go. For them, the gods had not simply been rulers of the universe, they had been caretakers of the mortal world, and without them, the future seemed more uncertain than ever. This tension between belief and reason became the battleground for ideas in the ancient world. Could the human mind truly understand the universe without divine guidance? Or was there an innate connection between humanity and the gods that could not be severed, even if the gods took a break? These questions would go on to shape philosophy, science, and religion for centuries to come. In many ways, the gods' absence left a fertile ground for new ideas. Just as the Greeks began to rely on their own wisdom and ingenuity, so too did they start to look to the natural world for answers, instead of waiting for divine revelations. This period of divine absence didn't just change the way they thought about their gods, it changed the way they thought about themselves. As you sit here tonight, drifting into a peaceful state, imagine living in a time where the gods, though ever present in myth, took a step back, leaving you with the freedom and the burden of shaping your own destiny. The world was still filled with mystery, uncertainty, and awe, but without the gods pulling all the strings, it was now a world where humans could truly begin to define themselves. Historians still debate whether the gods' absence was a blessing or a curse. For some, it was a moment of human triumph. For others, it was a time of great existential questioning. Either way, this strange pause in divine activity marked a critical juncture in the human story, where mortals began to see themselves as the true architects of their fate. As the gods continued their vacation, it wasn't just the mortals' daily lives that were changing. The very fabric of Greek mythology was being redefined. For millennia, the gods had been the ultimate authority, controlling the destinies of both mortals and immortals. But now, without their direct influence, something curious started to happen. Gods and heroes alike began to question their roles in the grand scheme of things. The boundaries between the divine and the mortal world were no longer as clear as they once had been. For centuries, mortals had been at the mercy of the gods. Their lives were shaped by divine favor or wrath, their fortunes determined by which god held sway over their fate. But now, without the gods directly intervening, mortals began to carve out their own destinies. Heroes no longer had to rely solely on divine help to succeed. They had to rely on their own wit, strength, and courage. But what did that mean for those gods who had once played such an active role in the world? Were they still necessary? The absence of the gods left a vacuum that had to be filled. As the gods took their time off from Olympus, their absence opened up space for new ways of thinking about power, authority, and identity. What happened when the mortals, once powerless in the face of divine wrath, suddenly had to manage without the gods meddling? Would they rise to the occasion or fall into chaos? At first glance, it might seem as if the gods' vacation was a blessing for mortals, a chance to step out from under the constant weight of divine oversight. But, as we look deeper, we realize that the gods' absence wasn't as simple as that. Without the divine, some mortals felt unmoored. There was no safety net to catch them if they stumbled. If you were a sailor without Poseidon's blessing, you were no longer assured of safe seas. If you were a farmer without Demeter's favor, your crops might fail despite your hard work. The gods' absence left mortals to deal with the harshness of the world on their own, and for some, that was a frightening prospect. But not everyone saw it as a negative. Some took advantage of the newfound freedom. Without the gods controlling their every move, mortals began to explore new ways of thinking and being. Philosophers like Socrates and Plato, who were already questioning the role of the gods in human affairs, found their ideas gaining traction. Without the gods there to dominate public discourse, the intellectual world opened up. Instead of relying on divine intervention, philosophers now looked to reason and observation as tools for understanding the world. The absence of the gods allowed for a flourishing of human thought that might have been impossible had the gods remained involved in mortal lives. This period also marked a shift in how mortals viewed their relationship with the gods. Without constant intervention, some began to question the very need for them. Why did they need the gods to guide their actions? Why should they make sacrifices or offerings to deities who seemed distant, uninterested, or simply too busy to care? The gods, for all their power, had been less and less involved in the lives of mortals in recent years, and now that they were taking a break, it prompted some to wonder whether the gods had ever been necessary at all. This tension between the old ways, where the gods held ultimate power, and the new ideas emerging in the absence of the gods marked a pivotal moment in ancient Greek thought. As mortals grew more self-reliant, they began to see themselves as the creators of their own destinies. The gods had given them the tools, strength, wit, and ambition, but it was up to the mortals to use them, and perhaps for the first time, mortals began to see the gods not as rulers to appease, but as figures from a bygone era, whose relevance was fading as the human world took more control. This shift didn't happen overnight. Of course, for many, the gods still held great sway. Their myths, stories, and symbols remained powerful, and the old rituals and beliefs continued to shape society. Yet, the gods' absence did spark a change in how mortals related to them. What once was a constant negotiation between mortal desires and divine will became more of a choice. Mortals could still offer their prayers, but now, there was a growing belief that their success or failure was in their own hands. The gods were no longer as necessary, and that realization sent ripples through the culture. Historians still debate whether this period of divine absence was the beginning of the end for traditional Greek religion or just a temporary shift. Some believe it was a time of intellectual rebirth, where humanity began to understand its own capacity for thought and creation. Others argue that it was a moment of spiritual crisis, a time when the gods' absence left a void that humanity could never fully fill. Either way, this period marked a significant turning point in Greek history, a time when the gods, though still present in myth, stepped back from their once dominant roles. Now, as the gods return to Olympus, the world has changed. The mortals have grown stronger, more independent. They've learned to navigate the world on their own, without relying on divine intervention. And as the gods resume their roles in mortal affairs, they find a world that is no longer as dependent on them as it once was. The mortals, who once relied on the gods for everything, now see themselves as active participants in their own fate. It's a new world, a world where the gods' absence has reshaped the very nature of existence. Historians still ponder whether the gods' absence during this period helped mortals evolve, or whether it marked the beginning of a cultural rift that would take centuries to heal. But one thing is certain, the mortal world had learned to walk on its own, and the gods' return would never be quite the same as it had been before. With the gods back on Olympus after their break, it must have been quite a strange reunion. Imagine the gods, fresh from their retreat, returning to find that the mortal world had continued in their absence. Mortals had managed to grow, adapt, and evolve without their constant intervention, creating a world that was more self-sufficient than it had ever been before. So, what did the gods make of this? Were they pleased that their creations had learned to navigate the complexities of life on their own, or did they feel like they had missed something important? It's hard to say for sure, but there's an interesting tension in the myths surrounding the gods' return. Some gods, like Zeus, were likely glad to return to the familiar rhythms of their rule, overseeing both the mortal and divine realms. Others, however, might have seen their absence a sign that things could operate more smoothly without their constant interference. There were certainly gods like Apollo, who, as the god of the sun, music, and healing, likely felt a continued responsibility to guide mortals in their artistic endeavors. But Apollo also realized that, perhaps, the human capacity for creativity wasn't entirely dependent on his divine inspiration. The mortals, as it turned out, could get by just fine on their own. Hera, on the other hand, might have had a more complicated reaction to the mortals' newfound independence. As the goddess of marriage and family, she was the ultimate guardian of family bonds and relationships. While she could guide and influence mortals, it must have been hard for her to let go of the influence she once wielded so effectively. After all, Hera had spent much of her divine time protecting families from outside interference, especially her husband's many affairs. But in a world without divine meddling, mortals might have begun to form their own sense of family, relationships, and society, free from divine intervention. Historians still argue over the role of divine influence in the shaping of ancient Greek society. Did the gods help humans achieve greatness, or were they simply obstacles to human progress? Some scholars believe that the gods were necessary for cultural development, guiding mortals in every aspect of their lives, from law to art. Others argue that the gods were merely symbolic figures that gave mortals a framework for understanding their world, but that true human growth happened when mortals began to think for themselves. As you consider the gods' return to Olympus, it's easy to see how complicated their relationship with mortals must have been. For centuries, they had been seen as the rulers of the cosmos, the ultimate authority in both the divine and mortal worlds. Yet, when they took a break, the mortals showed just how capable they were of thriving without them. And when the gods returned, they found a world that had grown, adapted, and changed in their absence. What's perhaps even more intriguing is that, during this time apart, mortals began to realize that they didn't need the gods as much as they once thought. They could govern themselves, make decisions, and shape their own fates. It was a profound shift in how humans viewed their place in the cosmos. This newfound independence, however, didn't mean that mortals were completely done with the gods. After all, the gods still represented something important: the mysteries of the universe, the forces of nature, and the underlying chaos that mortals could never fully control. Historians continue to debate the significance of the gods' absence and return. Did the mortals, in their brief time without the gods, begin to forge a new path in history? Some believe that the absence of divine guidance pushed the boundaries of human thought and creativity. Others suggest that the gods' return reminded mortals of their place in the world, that, ultimately, divine will still had power over the chaos that humans could never fully understand. The relationship between gods and mortals was complex, and the gods' brief break from their usual duties only emphasized this complexity. With the gods' return to Olympus, the balance between divine influence and mortal agency had shifted. The gods still had their role to play in the grand design of the universe, but their influence over the daily lives of mortals had diminished, and the mortals were now more aware of their own power and potential. It's almost as though, in taking a step back, the gods gave mortals the space they needed to recognize their own worth. And when they returned, they found that the world was no longer solely shaped by their divine hands. It was a world in which mortals, with their ideas, their art, and their philosophy, had come to the forefront. And so, as the gods resumed their familiar roles, overseeing the cosmos and influencing mortal affairs once more, it's clear that their time away didn't just affect the gods, it changed everything. The gods may have returned to Olympus, but they could no longer claim the same absolute control they once held. Mortals had learned something valuable in their absence, and that knowledge, that realization of their own power, was something that even the gods could not take away. As the gods resumed their celestial duties, the question remained: what did their return mean for both the divine and mortal worlds? Mortals, once completely reliant on the gods for everything from daily blessings to larger-than-life interventions, now found themselves at a crossroads. They had experienced a brief window of autonomy, a period of reflection that allowed them to develop new ideas, philosophies, and practices. But now, with the gods back on their thrones in Olympus, what would their return mean for the people they once ruled? At first glance, it might have seemed like a return to normalcy. The gods, after all, had always been part of the mortal world's tapestry. Mortals relied on them for everything from the success of their crops to victory in battle. The gods' return meant that they would once again restore order and provide the guidance that had been sorely missed. The world of divine favor was back in full swing, and for many, this was a welcome relief. After all, without the gods, life had felt chaotic, unpredictable, and a little bit too much like a free-for-all. But for those mortals who had tasted independence, the gods' return likely felt like a regression. During the time the gods were on their break, mortals had begun to redefine themselves. They had started to think for themselves, make their own decisions, and embrace their own potential. With the gods back in the picture, that hard-won independence might have felt like it was slipping away, and old patterns of reliance began to creep back in. The divine authority that had always been the foundation of Greek society was back, and with it, the notion that the gods were still in charge, no matter how much humans had learned to adapt without them. This is where the tension between divine authority and human autonomy becomes most apparent. The gods were more than just distant figures in the sky. They were intertwined with the very fabric of Greek culture, from the governance of the cities to the arts, politics, and daily routines. The gods' influence had shaped the way the Greeks understood themselves and the world around them. But now, in the wake of their absence, mortals had begun to question that influence. Could they continue to live with the same sense of independence that they had during the gods' time off? Or were they doomed to return to their old ways of dependence and sacrifice? It's here that the gods' return creates a kind of dilemma. The gods had always been both the rulers and the protectors of the mortal world. They were, in many ways, both a source of stability and a constant source of interference. They were the ones who ensured that the sun rose each day, that the winds blew favorably for sailors, and that the harvests were bountiful. But they were also the ones who meddled in mortal affairs, punishing those who displeased them and rewarding those who pleased them. The return of the gods brought stability, but it also brought the possibility of more interference, more divine whims that could change the course of mortal lives at any given moment. Historians still argue about the gods' role in Greek society. Did their influence truly benefit the mortals, or was it simply a way of keeping them in check, ensuring that they remained in their place in the grand cosmic order? Some believe that the gods' return to Olympus was a return to order, a return to the divine structure that made the world work. Others argue that it marked the beginning of the end of the old ways, a return to a system that no longer allowed for the kind of independence and self-reliance that mortals had briefly enjoyed. It's easy to imagine how this would have been a frustrating time for some mortals. Imagine a hero like Theseus, who had ventured into the labyrinth and defeated the Minotaur with only his own wits and strength. He had done so without divine intervention, relying on nothing but his own courage and resourcefulness. But now, with the gods back in full force, how would Theseus and other heroes feel? Would they continue to see themselves as self-made? Or would they once again feel the need to seek divine approval and favor? In many ways, the gods' return forced mortals to reassess their own place in the world. The gods were still there, still wielding their power, but mortals had learned something in their absence. They had learned that they could thrive without divine intervention, that they could shape their own destinies, and that realization wasn't something easily forgotten. The gods might have returned to Olympus, but the balance had shifted. Mortals now knew that they could make their own decisions, that they could shape their own fates. And though the gods' power remained formidable, their influence was no longer absolute. Historians still debate whether this shift in mortal consciousness, this newfound sense of independence, was a permanent change or a brief period of human growth before the gods returned to reclaim their dominance. Some argue that the gods' return simply reinforced the established order, with mortals once again submitting to divine authority. Others suggest that the experience of living without the gods, even for a short time, had a lasting impact on Greek thought and culture. Regardless of which side you take, one thing is clear: the world of Greek mythology would never be the same after the gods took their break. The return of the gods marked the end of an era of uncertainty and change for the mortals. But it also signaled the beginning of a new chapter, one in which mortals would have to navigate the delicate balance between divine influence and human autonomy. The gods were back, but mortals were no longer the same. They had learned that they could stand on their own, that they had the power to shape their own destinies. And with that knowledge, the gods' return would never quite be as all-encompassing as it had once been. As the gods returned to their places of power on Mount Olympus, the mortal world had undergone an important transformation. While the gods' absence had created a sense of freedom and self-reliance in the people, their return was met with a complex mix of emotions. Mortals, particularly those who had begun to think independently, now had to confront a new dynamic. The gods were back, but the influence they once held was no longer as absolute. The break had shifted the balance, and now the gods had to find their place in a world where mortals had tasted autonomy. It wasn't just the philosophers who felt the shift. The warriors, the farmers, the artists, and the craftsmen all began to see themselves as more than just pawns in a divine game. With no divine interventions to fall back on, many had found ways to push their own boundaries, whether by devising new techniques for farming, inventing better tools for warfare, or creating art without relying on Apollo's grace. But now, with the gods back in the picture, did these mortals need to once again seek divine approval? Imagine, for a moment, a craftsman in ancient Greece, hard at work shaping a statue or forging a piece of armor. Before the gods' break, such a craftsman might have given thanks to Hephaestus, god of fire and blacksmithing, hoping for a boost of skill or success in his craft. But now, having spent time working without divine influence, the craftsman feels a new sense of pride in his own abilities. He knows that his skill is his own, not a gift from a god, and he's learned to rely on his own expertise. The question now arises: does he return to offering sacrifices to Hephaestus, or does he continue to take pride in the work he's done without divine assistance? Historians still debate whether the return of the gods reinforced the idea that divine aid was essential for success, or whether it allowed mortals to reflect on their ability to shape their own fates. Some argue that the gods' return only reaffirmed the need for divine favor, while others suggest that the mortals, having tasted their own power, would never again be as reliant on the gods as they once were. This period of divine absence, for many, was transformative. It gave them a glimpse into a world where they could shape their own destinies, without having to answer to the whims of immortals. But the gods didn't make their return without challenges. Though they had always been the divine rulers, their absence had allowed a new way of thinking to take root in the mortal world. Even those who still worshipped the gods couldn't deny that something had changed. They had seen how the world could function without divine intervention, and that awareness couldn't be easily erased. The gods were no longer the unquestioned rulers of fate. They were part of a larger cosmic order, and their role in the mortal world had been shaken. Mortals might once have believed that their entire lives were guided by divine hands, but now, they understood that their actions had consequences independent of divine favor. What did this mean for the gods? For beings who had long been accustomed to having the world revolve around them, this shift must have felt unsettling. Mortals were no longer as willing to kneel before them and beg for blessings. Some gods, like Apollo, who was deeply involved in the arts and healing, might have seen this as a chance to embrace their roles without interfering too much in mortal affairs. But others, like Ares, the god of war, might have struggled with this newfound lack of influence. Ares thrived on chaos, and without the gods constantly throwing mortals into battle or conflict, where did his power fit into this new world? And what about Zeus? The king of the gods, who had once wielded the thunderbolt with authority, might have been the most impacted by this shift. Zeus had long seen himself as the ultimate authority, not just on Olympus, but in the mortal realm. Yet, after the break, he returned to find that his power had diminished. Mortals had discovered their own agency, and they were no longer as dependent on him as they had been. How would Zeus handle this change? Would he continue to intervene in mortal affairs, or would he accept that, perhaps, the world had moved on without him? The gods, now back on Olympus, had to navigate this new dynamic. They had always been the rulers, the guides, and the protectors of the mortal world, but in their absence, mortals had learned to rely on themselves, and this new independence changed everything. The gods had once ruled through fear and power, but now they had to contend with a world that no longer needed them as much as before. Some gods, like Athena, who had always valued wisdom and strategy, may have seen the mortals' newfound independence a sign of progress. Athena had long believed that wisdom could lead mortals to greatness, and now she saw that the mortals were, indeed, capable of great things on their own. But for others, like Hera and Poseidon, the gods' absence had been a reminder that their role in the world was not as unchallenged as it once had been. They had to adjust to the new reality, one in which the mortals were no longer as eager to worship, beg, or even listen. Historians still debate the impact of the gods' absence and return. Some see it as a moment of growth for both mortals and gods, a turning point where humans began to understand their own power. Others suggest that the gods' return reasserted the divine order, reinforcing the belief that the gods would always have the final say. Regardless of which perspective you take, it's clear that the gods' brief vacation and subsequent return marked a momentous shift in the relationship between the divine and mortal worlds. As the gods returned to their familiar roles on Olympus, there was a subtle, but profound shift in the way mortals viewed their place in the world. No longer were the gods the unquestioned rulers of the universe. Instead, they were now seen as just one part of the larger picture. Mortals had learned to live without divine intervention, and this new independence altered their relationship with the gods in ways that were both empowering and unsettling. For the gods, this new reality must have been a challenge. They were used to the idea that they could control the fate of mortals, that they were the ultimate authorities on all matters of life and death. But now, the gods had to contend with a world where mortals were no longer as reliant on them as they once were. The gods' absence had revealed that humans were capable of great things on their own, and the gods' return had to reckon with that newfound autonomy. Take, for example, Apollo, god of the sun, music, and prophecy. Apollo had always been a source of inspiration for the arts and healing, but during the time when the gods were on vacation, mortals had found their own creativity. Artists and musicians no longer waited for Apollo's blessing to create beautiful works of art or music. They simply created. Apollo's absence might have allowed mortals to explore new ways of thinking about creativity, free from the weight of divine expectation. But what would happen when Apollo returned? Would he still be seen as the ultimate patron of the arts, or would mortals begin to embrace their own creative power, independent of his influence? The same was true for Athena, goddess of wisdom and strategy. During the time when the gods were gone, mortals began to rely more on their own reasoning and intellect. Philosophers like Socrates and Plato were able to ask questions and explore ideas without divine interference. This intellectual flourishing was driven by the belief that humans could use logic and reason to understand the world around them, not just depend on the whims of the gods. Athena had always valued wisdom, and she might have seen this as a sign that mortals were finally living up to their potential. But even Athena, as a goddess of wisdom, had to acknowledge that the world had changed. Mortals no longer needed her to guide them. They had learned to think for themselves. And then there was Zeus, king of the gods. Zeus had always been the ruler of both the gods and the mortals, the one who ensured order in the cosmos. But in the absence of his constant interference, mortals had learned to govern themselves. They had built new systems of government, founded philosophies of justice, and relied on human wisdom to solve their problems. Zeus, returning to find a world where mortals were no longer as dependent on him, had to confront the fact that his role as the supreme ruler was no longer as absolute as it once had been. Historians still debate whether the gods' return to Olympus was a necessary reassertion of divine order or whether it was a symbolic gesture that didn't truly regain their former power. Some argue that the gods' return was essential to maintaining balance in the universe, while others suggest that it was an outdated system that no longer had the same hold on mortal lives. Either way, it's clear that the gods' absence allowed mortals to explore new paths, and when they returned, they found a world that was different from the one they had left. For mortals, the gods' return didn't immediately erase the progress they had made in their independence. While the gods' power still loomed large, it was no longer the only force shaping the world. Mortals had learned to look to themselves for answers, to embrace their own abilities and creativity. The gods' return didn't restore the old order. It was more like an acknowledgement of the changes that had already taken place. The gods, though still powerful, had to come to terms with the fact that mortals had evolved. They could no longer be the sole architects of the world's fate. Mortals had learned to live without divine intervention, and that knowledge could never be unlearned. In this way, the gods' return marked the end of an era of divine dominance and the beginning of a new era of mortal self-reliance. The gods would continue to play their roles, but they would no longer be the unquestioned rulers of the world. Mortals had learned to govern themselves, to create their own futures, and to shape their own destinies. The gods' power remained, but it was no longer the only force at work in the world. For the gods, this shift was likely difficult to accept. They had always been the ones to dictate the rules of the universe, to control the natural world, and to intervene in the lives of mortals. But now, with mortals discovering their own power and wisdom, the gods had to adjust. They were still needed, but their influence had diminished. Mortals were no longer the passive recipients of divine will. They were active participants in the shaping of their own lives. Historians continue to debate whether this shift in the relationship between the gods and mortals was a good thing or a bad thing. Some see it as a natural evolution, a step toward greater human independence and intellectual achievement. Others worrying that it marked the decline of divine authority, a loss of the connection between humans and the gods. Regardless of the outcome, one thing is clear: the absence of the gods and their eventual return had a profound impact on the way mortals saw themselves and their place in the cosmos. The gods had taught them to rely on divine favor, but the mortals had learned to rely on themselves. As the gods resumed their place in the heavens, it wasn't just their relationship with mortals that had changed. It was the entire landscape of Greek mythology. Mortals, having lived for a time without divine interference, now viewed their gods through a different lens. There was a newfound understanding among them that their lives didn't solely hinge on divine favor or wrath. The shift was subtle, yet powerful. It was as if the gods, in their absence, had allowed humanity to breathe and find their own place in the world, free from the constant tug of divine expectation. And now, with the gods back on Olympus, the world felt different, a little more independent, but still very much tethered to the ancient pantheon. At first glance, the gods' return might have seemed like a restoration of the old order. The rituals, the sacrifices, the divine proclamations, all resumed in their customary grandeur. Zeus would once again cast his thunderbolts from the sky, and Apollo would resume his role as the god of light and prophecy. Hera would ensure that the sanctity of marriage remained undisturbed, and Demeter would bless the harvest. But beneath this familiar surface, something had changed. Mortals had learned to live without the gods and had discovered the depths of their own potential. They no longer relied on divine intervention to make things happen. They had begun to create their own destinies, shaping their futures with their own hands. It was as though the gods, once rulers of all, had now become part of the larger cosmic order, rather than the ultimate force that controlled everything. Mortals were no longer mere puppets in the gods' grand play. They were active participants, making their own choices, charting their own courses. The gods had always been seen as the ones who determined the fate of the world, but now, with their return, they found themselves in a world that had changed in their absence. The mortals, having lived without their constant intervention, had learned to do things for themselves. Yet, despite this shift, the gods' influence was not entirely gone. They remained powerful, and their presence continued to be felt in the most significant moments of mortal life: wars, births, and the occasional natural disaster. However, their role was no longer as all-encompassing. The gods were no longer seen as the ultimate arbiters of fate. They had to coexist with a world that had learned to function without them. Take, for example, the city of Athens. In times of peace, mortals in the city have felt confident in their ability to manage their affairs without divine interference. They had established a democratic system where leaders were chosen by the people, and their fate was no longer determined by the gods. Yet, when war came, and the city was threatened, the Athenians would turn to their gods for help. The gods had once been seen as the ultimate protectors of their cities, but now, in a world where mortals had learned to govern themselves, the gods were sought only in times of crisis. They were no longer the ones who provided constant guidance. They were called upon when needed most. Historians still debate the nature of the gods' return. Some argue that their absence allowed for a kind of human flourishing, an era of intellectual, artistic, and political progress that was not shaped by divine whims. Others believe that the gods' return was necessary to restore order to a world that had grown too chaotic and self-reliant. Either way, it's clear that the relationship between the gods and mortals had irrevocably changed. The gods were still important, but they were no longer the only force shaping the mortal world. Mortals had learned to stand on their own. For the gods, this shift in perspective must have been difficult to accept. After all, they had long been the ones who held the power, deciding the fate of mortals and even other gods. Yet, in their absence, they had seen mortals take their destiny into their own hands. The gods had always been seen as the rulers of the cosmos, but now they had to come to terms with the fact that mortals could exist without them, and perhaps even thrive. Take Hera, for example. As the goddess of marriage and family, her role had always been to ensure the sanctity of relationships and to protect the bonds between mortals. But when the gods took a break, Hera's role shifted. The mortal world began to define its own views on marriage, family, and relationships. Mortals no longer needed to rely on Hera's protection. They had developed their own systems of understanding and laws governing relationships. Hera may have returned to her role as the goddess of family, but her influence was no longer as absolute. Mortals had created their own moral systems, and they had learned to live without divine guidance. This shift didn't just affect the gods of love and relationships. Even gods like Poseidon, who had ruled the seas, were affected. The ocean was still vast and dangerous, but mortals had found ways to navigate it by building better ships, using more sophisticated navigation tools, and relying on their own skill and knowledge. Poseidon had once been the ruler of the seas, but now mortals took responsibility for their voyages. They still honored him, but they no longer saw him as the one who decided their fate on the water. As for Zeus, the king of the gods, his return must have been the most complex of all. Zeus had always been the one who maintained order in both the divine and mortal realms. But when he returned to find that mortals were governing themselves, it must have been a bittersweet realization. His power had diminished, and he was no longer the only force guiding the world. Mortals had learned to rely on themselves, and they no longer needed the constant intervention of the gods. For Zeus, the question became, how could he still exert his influence without returning to the old ways of absolute control? Historians still argue about the gods' role in shaping the mortal world after their return. Some suggest that their return was simply a restoration of the old divine order, where the gods resumed their familiar roles as rulers and protectors. Others believe that the gods' influence was never fully restored to its former glory. Mortals, having tasted autonomy, could never completely return to a world where the gods held all the power. Whatever the truth, one thing is certain: the gods' return marked a turning point in the relationship between the divine and the mortal realms. Mortals were no longer as dependent on the gods, and the gods were no longer as omnipotent as they had once been. With the return of the gods to their thrones on Mount Olympus, it wasn't just the mortals who had to adjust, so did the gods themselves. In their absence, mortals had grown more self-sufficient, more independent, and more self-reliant than they had ever been. They had embraced their own potential, creating their own destinies without the constant interference of divine powers. But now that the gods were back, how would they fit into this new world? The mortals had learned to navigate life without divine intervention, and the gods had to figure out their role in this transformed world. For the gods, this was a complex moment. They had always been at the top of the cosmic hierarchy, revered and feared for their immense powers. But with the mortals now more capable of controlling their own lives, the gods were forced to reckon with the fact that they were no longer the sole arbiters of fate. Mortals had learned to think for themselves, to make their own decisions, and to solve their problems without looking up to Olympus for guidance. The gods had always played an active role in mortal affairs, guiding them, punishing them, rewarding them, but now their power had waned. How would they adjust to this new reality? Take Zeus, the king of the gods. Zeus had always been the ultimate ruler, the one who commanded the skies and kept order among the gods and mortals. But after his break, when he returned to find that mortals had learned to govern themselves, it must have been a humbling experience. The world had moved on, and Zeus could no longer rely on his usual methods of control. He couldn't simply strike down a mortal with a lightning bolt for disobedience, nor could he make thunder his ultimate tool of authority. The mortals had discovered their own power, and they no longer saw Zeus as the unchallenged ruler they once did. He had to find new ways to maintain order, to regain influence. Then there was Hera, the goddess of marriage and family. Hera had always prided herself on maintaining the sanctity of relationships, watching over marriages and ensuring that the bonds between mortals were strong. But with the gods taking a break, the world of relationships didn't collapse. Mortals had developed their own understanding of love, family, and partnership. In the absence of divine oversight, they had created their own moral systems, their own rules for how relationships should function. While Hera might still be revered, her authority was no longer absolute. Mortals had found a way to live without her constant guidance, and this must have been a hard pill for the goddess to swallow. Artemis, the goddess of the hunt, and Apollo, her twin brother, had also seen their influence diminish. Apollo had once been the patron of the arts, ensuring that music, poetry, and prophecy flourished. Yet in the gods' absence, mortals had created their own artistic traditions, their own expressions of beauty and culture. Apollo could no longer claim to be the sole source of inspiration. He had to share the stage with mortal creators who had learned to find their own muse. And then there was Poseidon, god of the sea. Poseidon had long been the one who ruled the oceans, whose moods controlled the tides and the weather. Sailors had long turned to him for safety on their voyages, offering sacrifices in hopes of smooth sailing. But without Poseidon's blessings, sailors had started to rely on their own skill and knowledge. They no longer saw him as the sole provider of safety on the seas. They had learned to navigate the waters with technology and expertise, and while Poseidon still had power over the sea, his influence was now more symbolic than essential. Even gods like Ares, the god of war, had to reckon with the mortals' newfound independence. War was no longer just about divine favor. Mortals had developed their own strategies, their own systems of warfare, relying less on the gods and more on human innovation. Ares, once the god who inspired soldiers and guided them to victory, was now a more distant figure. While the violence and chaos of battle still continued, mortals had learned to fight their own wars. In this world, the gods had returned, but they found themselves in a delicate balancing act. They were no longer the sole forces shaping the mortal world. Mortals had gained a new sense of autonomy, and the gods had to learn to share the stage. For centuries, the gods had been everything: the creators, the controllers, the arbiters of fate. But now, in the wake of their absence, mortals had begun to take control of their own lives. They could still honor the gods, still offer prayers and sacrifices, but they no longer relied on divine intervention for their success. Historians still debate whether the gods' return marked the restoration of the old order, or whether it was the beginning of a new era, where mortals would play a more active role in shaping their own fates. Some believe that the gods, upon returning, simply resumed their old ways, imposing their will on the world without much change. Others argue that the gods, after witnessing the mortals' independence, realized that their role in the world had shifted forever. The return of the gods wasn't just a return to old habits, it was a recognition that the balance had changed, and the gods would have to adjust to a world where mortals were no longer as dependent on them. And yet, despite this new dynamic, the gods were still part of the fabric of the world. They might not control every aspect of mortal life, but they were still there, providing a sense of connection to the divine. Mortals still prayed, still made offerings, and still turned to the gods for guidance in moments of crisis. But the world had changed. The gods were no longer the sole rulers of fate. They had to coexist with mortals who were no longer as easily swayed by their power. In the end, the return of the gods wasn't just about restoring order. It was about recognizing that the mortal world had grown, had learned, and had evolved. Mortals had discovered their own strength, their own intelligence, and their own capacity for greatness. And the gods, while still powerful, had to reckon with the fact that they were no longer the only forces shaping the course of the world. As the gods returned to Olympus, the world they had once dominated was different from the one they had left behind. The mortals had learned to live without their interference, to adapt and thrive in their absence. It wasn't that the mortals had rejected the gods, but their time apart had led to an awakening, a realization that they could live with or without divine guidance. This wasn't an outright rebellion against the gods, but more of a quiet evolution. Mortals had learned that while the gods might offer blessings or curses, the true power lay in their own hands. The gods' return didn't erase the changes that had taken place. The intellectual movements that had flourished in their absence were not easily forgotten. Philosophers like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle had begun to shape the minds of mortals in ways that were independent of divine influence. Their teachings focused on human reason, ethics, and the pursuit of knowledge, emphasizing that mortals could find their own way to wisdom without waiting for divine intervention. These new ways of thinking had taken root in Greek society, and despite the gods' return, they would continue to grow. But for some of the gods, this shift was difficult to accept. The gods had always seen themselves as the ultimate source of power and wisdom. They had been the ones who decided the fate of mortals, who guided them through their trials, and who provided them with the gifts of creativity, intellect, and strength. But now, the mortals were finding their own way, and the gods had to reckon with the fact that their influence was no longer absolute. Take Athena, for example. As the goddess of wisdom, Athena had always been revered for her insight and guidance. She had been the one to offer strategic advice to heroes like Odysseus and Perseus, helping them navigate the challenges they faced. But in the absence of the gods, mortals had begun to rely on their own wisdom, seeking answers from within rather than looking to Athena for guidance. This shift in how mortals approached wisdom and knowledge was likely unsettling for Athena, who had long seen herself as the ultimate source of insight. Zeus, the king of the gods, also had to come to terms with this new reality. As the ruler of both the gods and mortals, Zeus had long held absolute power. He had been the one to strike down those who defied him, the one who ensured that the cosmic order was maintained. But when the gods took their break, Zeus found that the mortal world had continued without him. And when he returned, he found that mortals were no longer as dependent on his authority. Zeus had to accept that, while his power was still formidable, it no longer held the same sway over mortal affairs. Mortals had learned to govern themselves, to find solutions to their problems without relying on Zeus' thunderbolt to settle disputes. Historians still debate the significance of the gods' return. Some argue that their return to Olympus marked the restoration of the old divine order, with mortals once again submitting to divine will. Others suggest that the return of the gods was not a return to the old ways, but rather a recognition that the relationship between the gods and mortals had fundamentally changed. Mortals were no longer the passive recipients of divine favor. They had learned to shape their own destinies, and the gods had to adapt to this new reality. Perhaps the most profound change came in the way mortals viewed their relationship with the gods. For centuries, mortals had lived in fear of the gods' wrath, making sacrifices and offering prayers in hopes of earning their favor. But after the gods took their break, mortals realized that they didn't need the gods to guide them. They could rely on their own strength, intellect, and creativity to navigate the world. And while the gods still played a role in the world, their influence was no longer as absolute. Mortals had learned that their fate was not solely in the hands of the gods. They had the power to shape their own futures. For some, this realization brought a sense of freedom. No longer did they have to make offerings or appease gods to ensure their success. They could act on their own accord, free from the pressure of divine judgment. But for others, the absence of the gods left a sense of loss. The gods had provided structure, meaning, and purpose to their lives, and without them, the world felt a little more uncertain. It's this tension that continued to shape the relationship between mortals and gods after the gods' return. The gods had once been the unquestioned rulers of the universe, but now they had to share the stage with mortals who had discovered their own power. Mortals still respected the gods, still honored them with prayers and sacrifices, but they no longer saw them as the ultimate authority. They had learned that they could stand on their own, and that was a lesson that even the gods couldn't undo. The gods' return to Olympus didn't mark the end of mortal independence. It marked the beginning of a new chapter. Mortals had learned to live without divine intervention, and that knowledge would shape the course of human history for centuries to come. The gods may have returned, but the world they returned to was one in which mortals had learned to carve out their own place in the cosmos. They had tasted freedom, and nothing could take that away from them. Historians still reflect on the impact of this period of divine absence and return. Some believe it was a necessary moment in the evolution of Greek thought, where mortals were forced to reckon with their own power. Others argue that it was a brief period of independence, one that would eventually fade as mortals returned to their traditional ways of relying on the gods. Either way, the gods' return was a turning point in the relationship between the divine and the mortal, and it reshaped the way mortals viewed themselves, their gods, and their place in the universe. As the mortals began to navigate their new world without the gods' constant intervention, one might think that this newfound autonomy would lead to a more peaceful, orderly existence. After all, humans were now responsible for their own actions, decisions, and destinies, right? But as the gods returned to their familiar positions in the pantheon, they found a very different mortal world than the one they had left behind. It wasn't simply that mortals had grown independent. They had also begun to redefine what it meant to be human, what it meant to be free from divine influence. And now, the gods had to reconcile this new understanding of mortals with their own ancient, divine expectations. For mortals, this period of autonomy had been both enlightening and unsettling. The gods' absence had allowed them to explore their own potential, but that didn't mean that the world had become an ideal place. Without divine guidance, mortals had made mistakes, created conflicts, and faced the unpredictable consequences of their own actions. They had not suddenly become perfect or wise. In fact, without the gods stepping in to correct their mistakes, mortals often had to confront the chaos that their new independence brought. The absence of divine intervention had revealed how fragile and imperfect the human condition truly was. The gods' return, however, wasn't just about reasserting their dominance over the mortal realm. It was about understanding the nature of change and how their relationship with mortals had evolved. The gods couldn't simply return and resume their old methods of control. They had to learn to coexist with the mortals who had learned to live without them. Zeus, as king of the gods, might have thought that his return would signal the restoration of order, but he quickly realized that the mortals no longer viewed him as the all-powerful ruler who could decide their fate with a snap of his fingers. Zeus had always been seen as the embodiment of divine authority, the one who held the power to shape the universe with his will. But now, after the mortals had learned to navigate the world on their own, Zeus had to come to terms with the fact that his role had changed. Mortals no longer depended on him to mete out justice or guide their actions. They had learned to rely on their own judgment, their own strength, and their own sense of morality. Zeus may have returned to Olympus with his thunderbolt in hand, but his thunder didn't have the same effect it once did. What does a king do when the world he once ruled has changed? When his subjects no longer view him as the ultimate authority, but as just another figure in a much larger, more complex world. This was the dilemma facing Zeus and the other gods. They were still powerful, yes, but their influence was no longer as all-encompassing as it had once been. Mortals had begun to govern themselves, to make their own choices, and to shape their own destinies without waiting for divine approval. Hera, the goddess of marriage and family, faced a similar challenge. She had long been the guardian of familial bonds, ensuring that mortals followed the sacred laws of marriage and family life. But with the gods on vacation, mortals had found new ways to understand and navigate their relationships. They still honored Hera, but they no longer depended on her to define what it meant to be married, to be a family. Mortals had begun to create their own institutions, their own social structures, and their own rules for living. Hera's role as the ultimate authority on family life had diminished, just as Zeus' role as the ultimate authority on fate had been weakened. Even the more active gods, like Ares, the god of war, had to adjust to this new reality. For centuries, Ares had been the god who guided soldiers and warriors into battle, inspiring them to fight with honor and strength. But now, in a world where mortals could navigate warfare on their own, Ares found that his influence was no longer as crucial. Battles still raged, of course, but they were fought with human strategies and technologies, not with divine intervention. Mortals had learned to fight their own wars, and Ares had to accept that he wasn't the one controlling the outcomes. In a sense, the return of the gods didn't just mark a return to old ways, it was a reckoning. Mortals had changed, and the gods had to figure out how to adapt to this new world where they no longer held absolute power. There was a delicate balance that needed to be struck. The gods were still important, still revered and honored, but they were no longer the central figures that mortals depended on for every aspect of life. The gods had to find their place in a world that had, in their absence, discovered its own capacity for growth, change, and self-reliance. Historians still debate whether the gods' return truly marked the restoration of their old dominance, or whether it was simply a return to a new, more complex relationship between mortals and immortals. Some suggest that the gods' influence would never again be as absolute as it once was, while others argue that their return was a necessary restoration of cosmic order. Either way, the gods' return marked a significant turning point in the way the Greek world understood power, authority, and self-determination. For the mortals, the return of the gods was not a complete loss of independence. They had learned something important during the gods' break, something that could never be erased. They had learned that their own power, their own intellect, and their own creativity were just as valuable as the gods' divine gifts. The gods' return did not undo this knowledge, it simply added a new layer to the complex relationship between mortals and immortals. As the gods resumed their roles in the world, they did so with the understanding that the mortal world had changed. The mortals may still honor the gods, may still offer sacrifices and prayers, but they no longer saw them as the sole rulers of their fate. The gods had returned, but they were no longer the unquestioned rulers of the cosmos. Mortals had learned to govern themselves, to rely on their own strength, and to shape their own destinies. As the gods resumed their familiar places in Olympus, they found themselves not just reasserting control, but negotiating their role in a world that had changed in their absence. It wasn't just about their influence being diminished. Mortals had undergone a fundamental shift in how they viewed their own power and their place in the cosmos. The gods, once the unquestioned rulers, now faced a much more complex dynamic. They were still revered, still honored, but their role in mortal lives was no longer as all-encompassing. Mortals had learned that they could stand on their own, and that meant that the gods had to adjust to a new reality. But what exactly did the gods' return mean for the mortal world? Now that things had shifted so dramatically, the gods were no longer seen as the omnipotent forces they once were. They had become part of a larger tapestry, with mortals taking more of the lead in shaping their own fates. The question for the gods was no longer how they could exert their influence over every aspect of mortal life. It was about how they could coexist with a world that had learned to function without their constant guidance. Let's take Zeus, the king of the gods, as an example. Zeus had always been the ultimate authority, the one who wielded the thunderbolt and ensured that the world ran smoothly. He had been the one to mete out justice, punish wrongdoers, and control the very elements of the universe. But now, with mortals having tasted their own autonomy, Zeus found himself in an awkward position. He was still revered as the king of the gods, but his power was no longer absolute. Mortals had learned that they could make decisions, solve problems, and guide their own destinies without waiting for Zeus to intervene. How could he maintain his authority in a world where mortals no longer depended on him to decide their fates? In many ways, Zeus' return symbolized the tension between old and new ways of thinking. The old order, where gods were the ultimate rulers and everything depended on their whims, had been challenged. The new world, where mortals had gained a sense of self-sufficiency, was one where Zeus' authority is as absolute. This didn't mean that Zeus was irrelevant, but it did mean that he had to find a new way to relate to the world. He could no longer simply wield his power from above. He had to adapt to a world where mortals had learned to govern themselves. The same could be said for the other gods. Take Hera, for instance. As the goddess of marriage and family, Hera had long been seen as the protector of relationships, ensuring that marriages were honored and that families remained intact. But when the gods took their break, mortals had already begun to form their own understanding of relationships. Marriage and family were no longer solely under Hera's control. Mortals had developed their own structures, their own rules for how relationships should work. Hera's return was not a return to the old order, but rather an acknowledgement that mortals could govern their own relationships. Hera's role, while still significant, was no longer absolute. The gods who governed other aspects of life also found themselves in a similar situation. Take Apollo, the god of music, prophecy, and healing. Apollo had long been seen as the divine inspiration for the arts and healing, guiding mortals to creativity and health. But in the absence of divine intervention, mortals had learned to create art, music, and healing practices on their own. The gods' influence in these areas had waned, and Apollo had to accept that mortals were no longer completely reliant on him for their artistic or healing endeavors. Apollo's role had changed. He was still an important figure, but his place in the creative and healing world was no longer as central. Similarly, Poseidon, god of the sea, had once been seen as the ruler of the oceans. Sailors prayed to him before embarking on their journeys, hoping for his blessing and protection. But with the god's absence, mortals had learned to navigate the seas on their own. They no longer relied solely on Poseidon's favor to ensure safe travels. The seas were still dangerous, of course, but mortals had developed new technologies and skills to face the challenges of the ocean. Poseidon's role had diminished, but his influence remained a reminder of the forces of nature that could never be fully controlled. For the gods, the return to Olympus was a reminder of the world that had changed in their absence. They had once been the rulers, the ones who decided the fate of mortals. But now, they had to coexist with a world that had learned to function without them. Mortals had discovered their own power, and the gods' role had shifted from one of dominance to one of guidance. The gods were still revered, but they were no longer the ultimate authority. Historians still debate the impact of the gods' return. Some believe that their return marked a restoration of divine order, while others suggest that it symbolized a recognition that the gods' role in mortal affairs had changed forever. Regardless of how one interprets the gods' return, it's clear that their absence had allowed mortals to explore their own potential, to create their own systems of understanding, and to shape their own futures. As mortals learned to live without divine intervention, they discovered that they had the power to govern their own lives. The gods, once seen as the ultimate controllers of fate, were now just one part of the larger world. Mortals had learned that they were not completely at the mercy of the gods. They could make their own choices, create their own destinies, and shape their own futures. And as the gods returned to Olympus, they were left to grapple with the fact that mortals had learned to stand on their own. As the gods returned to Olympus and resumed their divine duties, they couldn't ignore the fact that the mortals they once ruled had changed. The world had shifted, and so had the relationship between gods and humans. The gods had always been the ultimate authorities, but now, in the wake of their absence, they found themselves facing a mortal world that was far more self-reliant, more capable, and more independent than before. The mortals had learned to shape their own lives, make their own decisions, and navigate the world without divine intervention. How, then, did the gods fit into this new reality? Zeus, the king of the gods, had long held the mantle of ultimate authority. As ruler of the sky, he was the one who controlled thunder, lightning, and the fates of both gods and mortals. But when Zeus returned to find a world where mortals had learned to govern themselves, he must have felt a shift in the cosmic balance. His power, while still immense, was no longer as absolute as it had once been. The mortals no longer looked to him as the sole arbiter of their destinies. They had learned that their fate was not solely in the hands of the gods, but in their own. It's a tough pill for a god like Zeus to swallow. He had always been the one who dispensed justice, settled disputes, and made the ultimate decisions for both gods and mortals. His thunderbolt was a symbol of his power, and the very sky itself seemed to bend to his will. But now, the world had moved on, and Zeus had to accept that the mortals were no longer as dependent on him as they once had been. The gods who governed other aspects of mortal life had to confront similar realizations. Hera, the goddess of marriage and family, had long been revered for her role in ensuring the sanctity of relationships. But when the gods took their break, mortals had already begun to forge their own understanding of family and relationships. They no longer needed Hera to dictate the rules of marriage. Hera's influence, while still respected, was no longer the absolute authority it had once been. Mortals had learned to navigate relationships on their own, and Hera's role had changed along with them. Take Artemis, the goddess of the hunt and protector of young women. She had long been the figure to turn to for protection in the wilds, for strength, and for guidance. But without divine intervention, mortals had learned to protect themselves, to hunt, and to survive in ways that didn't require Artemis' blessing. Artemis, while still the goddess of the hunt, had to accept that mortals could take care of themselves, and that her role was not as central as it had been before. Apollo, the god of music, poetry, and prophecy, faced a similar dilemma. While Apollo had long been seen as the patron of the arts, guiding mortals in their creative endeavors, the absence of divine intervention had allowed mortals to explore their own creativity. Artists, poets, and musicians had learned to create without Apollo's inspiration, and the gods' return had to reckon with that new reality. Mortals were no longer waiting for divine inspiration, they were finding their own. And what about Poseidon, the god of the seas? Sailors had always turned to Poseidon for calm seas and safe voyages, but in the god's absence, they had learned to navigate the oceans on their own. They relied on their knowledge of the stars, their ships, and their skills to survive. Poseidon's role, once so vital to their survival, had diminished, and the seas that had once been his domain were now something that mortals could face without divine protection. It wasn't just that the gods had lost their authority, it was that mortals had gained something. They had gained knowledge, independence, and a sense of self-sufficiency that had never been there before. They had learned to rely on their own intellect and creativity to navigate the challenges of life, and that was a profound shift. The gods, who had once shaped every aspect of mortal existence, now found themselves in a world where their influence was just one factor among many. For some gods, this shift was easier to accept than for others. Athena, for example, goddess of wisdom and strategy, may have been more inclined to embrace the idea of mortals finding their own way. After all, her very essence was bound up in the pursuit of knowledge and intellect. She had always believed that humans could achieve greatness through wisdom, and now, it seemed, they were doing just that. Athena had to recognize that the mortals were not just her creations. They were capable of achieving great things without her constant guidance. But for other gods, like Ares, the god of war, the shift was more difficult. Ares thrived on conflict and chaos, and his role had always been to guide mortals through the bloodshed of battle. But without divine influence, mortals had learned to fight their own wars, using their own strategies and weapons. The god of war, once so essential to the survival of armies, had to come to terms with the fact that mortals could wage war on their own. Historians still debate the significance of this shift in the balance of power between gods and mortals. Was it a natural evolution, or was it a sign that the gods had lost their grip on the mortal world? Some suggest that the gods' return simply reinforced the established order, with the gods resuming their roles as the ultimate authorities. Others argue that the return of the gods marked the beginning of a new era, one where the mortals would play a more active role in shaping their own fates. One thing is clear: the mortals had learned something important in the gods' absence. They had learned that they could survive and even thrive without divine intervention. They had discovered that their strength, intelligence, and creativity were their own to wield. The gods, while still important figures in the Greek world, no longer had the same hold over mortals. They were still revered, still honored, but their influence had waned. The mortals had learned to live without them, and that knowledge, once gained, could never be unlearned. As the gods settled back into their roles on Olympus, the question remained: what was the future of their relationship with mortals? The world had changed during their absence, and although they had returned to their thrones, they couldn't ignore the fact that mortals no longer viewed them as absolute rulers. The gods' power, while still immense, was no longer the central force that shaped the course of human lives. Mortals had learned to take control of their own destinies, to rely on their intelligence, creativity, and strength to navigate the challenges of life. But the gods, despite this shift, were not without purpose. They still had their roles to play in the cosmic order, still held power over the elements, the seas, the skies, and the forces of nature. Yet their influence over the everyday lives of mortals had been diminished. It wasn't that the gods were irrelevant. They were still deeply connected to the fabric of the world, but the mortals had learned to live without them. And this change in the relationship between gods and mortals had profound consequences for both. Take, for instance, the heroes of Greek mythology. Once upon a time, heroes like Heracles, Perseus, and Odysseus had relied heavily on the gods' intervention, whether it was Athena's strategic wisdom, Hermes' cunning, or Zeus' thunderbolts. The gods were active participants in the heroic stories, aiding and sometimes hindering the heroes in their quests. But now, after the gods had taken their break, heroes had to learn to navigate their challenges without divine assistance. This shift marked a key moment in how heroes were defined. They were no longer merely pawns of the gods. They became symbols of human perseverance, bravery, and self-reliance. They overcame monsters, completed quests, and triumphed in battle, not because the gods willed it, but because of their own strength and ingenuity. Heroes like Heracles, who had been shaped by the gods' influence, would now be seen in a new light. Instead of relying on divine help, he became a hero not by divine favor, but by his own determination. His labors, though still aided by gods like Athena, were increasingly framed as tests of his mortal capabilities. The gods were still there in the background, of course, but it was no longer as simple as believing that the gods controlled the outcomes. Heracles, as well as other heroes, was now a testament to the idea that humans, too, could shape their own fate. Similarly, Odysseus, who had once been a mortal reliant on Athena's wisdom and Hermes' guidance, had to come to terms with the fact that, even without the gods, he could still survive. The gods, who had once guided his journey and protected him from harm, had taken a step back, and in doing so, they gave Odysseus the space to prove that he could navigate his long journey home not just through divine favor, but through his own cunning and leadership. This shift in the perception of heroes reflected the larger cultural change taking place in the Greek world. Heroes had once been defined by their relationships with the gods, but now they were defined by their mortal qualities. Heroes like Heracles and Odysseus embodied the qualities of perseverance, wisdom, and bravery that mortals could look up to and emulate. The gods no longer held the monopoly on greatness. Mortals could achieve greatness on their own. But while heroes were now seen as self-made, the gods' return brought a sense of order back to the world. The gods had once been seen as the ones who shaped fate, and even though mortals had learned to forge their own paths, they still needed the gods for the larger cosmic balance. The gods' return was like a reminder that, while mortals could take control of their lives, there were still forces in the universe beyond their understanding. The gods were not gone entirely, they were simply not the rulers they once had been. This didn't mean that the mortals no longer turned to the gods for help. They still sought divine guidance in times of great need. They made offerings to ask for help in battle, for a bountiful harvest, or for the safety of their families. The gods were still worshipped, still honored in rituals and festivals, but mortals no longer felt the same overwhelming dependence on them. The gods had become figures of tradition, rather than figures of total authority. Mortals, while still acknowledging the gods' power, had learned to navigate life on their own terms. In the same way, society itself had evolved. The gods' return didn't erase the intellectual and political advancements that had taken place during their absence. The ideas of philosophy, democracy, and self-governance had taken root, and they couldn't simply be undone by the return of divine power. The gods' influence in the mortal world was no longer absolute, and the political systems and philosophical ideas that had developed in their absence would continue to shape the future of Greek civilization. Historians continue to debate whether the gods' return marked the restoration of the old order, or whether it was a new phase in the relationship between gods and mortals. Some believe that the gods were essential in maintaining balance and ensuring the proper functioning of the cosmos. Others argue that the mortals, having learned to govern themselves, no longer needed the gods' intervention in every aspect of their lives. Either way, the gods' return was a reminder of the complexity of their role in the mortal world. They were powerful, yes, but their influence had been reshaped by the mortals' newfound independence. As you think about this, imagine how the world must have felt as the gods returned. The air might have seemed a little heavier, the gods' presence a little more palpable. Yet, at the same time, there was a sense that the mortals had changed. They had learned to stand on their own, to create their own destinies, and the gods' return had to adjust to this new world. The gods were no longer the absolute rulers of the universe, they were part of a larger, more complex order, one where mortals had learned to hold their own. With the gods back on Olympus, there was an undeniable shift in the dynamics between the divine and mortal realms. The gods, though still powerful and revered, were no longer the sole controllers of mortal fate. Mortals, having experienced a brief period of independence, had gained a sense of self-determination that could never be erased. The return of the gods wasn't a simple restoration of divine order. It was the beginning of a new phase in the relationship between the gods and the mortals. The gods would still guide, protect, and inspire, but the mortals no longer viewed them as the sole arbiters of their lives. It's easy to imagine how this might have felt for the gods, particularly for those like Zeus and Hera, who had long been accustomed to absolute power over the mortal world. For Zeus, the king of the gods, the return to Olympus must have been a bittersweet experience. While he still wielded immense power, he could no longer command the same reverence and obedience he once had. Mortals no longer saw him as the ultimate ruler of the cosmos. They had learned to govern themselves, and their understanding of the world had expanded beyond the divine realm. Zeus' role had changed, from a powerful deity who controlled fate to a figure who now had to share his influence with the growing autonomy of mortal society. Hera, the queen of the gods, faced a similar challenge. As the goddess of marriage and family, she had always been the ultimate protector of relationships, ensuring that families adhered to divine standards. But in the absence of divine intervention, mortals had created their own systems of relationships and social structures. While they still honored Hera, her authority over the sanctity of marriage was no longer absolute. Mortals had learned to form their own moral systems, and Hera had to accept that her role in guiding relationships had diminished. Even gods like Apollo and Athena, who had long been seen as essential to human creativity and wisdom, found their roles shifting. Apollo, once the ultimate patron of music and the arts, now faced a world where artists no longer depended on his blessings to create. Mortals had developed their own artistic traditions, and the gods' influence in this area was no longer as dominant. Similarly, Athena, the goddess of wisdom, had long been seen as the divine source of knowledge and strategy. But in the absence of the gods, mortals had begun to rely on their own intellect and reasoning to solve problems. They no longer needed divine wisdom to guide them. They had learned to think for themselves. Poseidon, the god of the seas, also had to come to terms with the mortals' newfound independence. Sailors had long prayed to him for safe passage across the seas, but with the god's absence, they had learned to navigate the oceans on their own. Mortals had developed new techniques for sailing, navigation, and weather forecasting, making Poseidon's role in their journeys less central. Though they still honored him, his power over the seas was no longer as absolute. This period of divine absence had forced both gods and mortals to rethink their roles in the cosmic order. For mortals, the absence of the gods had been a liberating experience. They had learned to rely on their own strength, intelligence, and creativity. They had discovered that they didn't need divine intervention to succeed. They could create their own futures. For the gods, however, the absence had been a wake-up call. They had always seen themselves as the rulers of both divine and mortal realms, but now they had to share the stage with mortals who had discovered their own power. Historians still debate the significance of the gods' return. Some argue that their return marked a restoration of divine order, while others suggest that it was a recognition of the growing autonomy of mortals. The gods' return did not undo the progress mortals had made during their absence. It simply marked the beginning of a new chapter. The gods were no longer the unquestioned rulers of fate. They had to coexist with a world that had learned to shape its own destiny. For the gods, this new world was a reminder that they could no longer dictate the course of mortal lives with the same authority they once had. Mortals had gained a new understanding of their own place in the universe, and the gods had to adjust to this new reality. The gods could still offer their guidance, their blessings, and their protection, but they were no longer the sole architects of fate. Mortals had discovered their own power, and that knowledge would forever change the relationship between the gods and the mortals. This shift was not without its challenges. While mortals had gained independence, they were still faced with the uncertainty of life. The world was no longer guided by the gods' whims, and that left room for chaos and unpredictability. But in the absence of divine intervention, mortals had learned to rely on their own abilities to navigate the complexities of existence. And while the gods' return brought a sense of order, it also reminded mortals of their own agency, their ability to shape their futures, even in a world where the gods still held sway. The gods' return marked the end of an era, a time when mortals were fully dependent on the divine to shape their fates. But it also marked the beginning of a new chapter, one in which mortals would never again be as reliant on the gods. The gods' influence would continue to be felt, but mortals had learned that they were capable of much more than they had ever realized. They had learned that they could control their own destinies, that their fates were no longer entirely in the hands of the gods. And so, as the gods resumed their positions in the cosmic order, they found themselves sharing the stage with mortals who had discovered their own power. The gods, still revered and respected, were now part of a world in which mortals were no longer passive participants. They were active creators of their own lives, with the gods now playing a supporting role in a much more complex, interconnected world. As the gods took their seats back on Olympus, they found themselves in a world that had irrevocably changed. The mortals, who had once been completely dependent on their divine overseers, were now the architects of their own futures. They had learned to live without the gods' constant interference, and this had sparked a transformation in both mortal society and the gods' perception of their role in the world. The return of the gods, while still marking a return to some familiar practices, was also a moment of reflection for both the gods and the mortals. Zeus, once the omnipotent ruler of both gods and mortals, was now faced with a new kind of challenge. While his power was still vast, his role had shifted. Mortals no longer saw him as the sole decider of their fates. Instead, they had begun to see themselves as co-creators of their destinies. Zeus, the god who once controlled the skies and the heavens with his thunderbolt, had to come to terms with the fact that his authority had been shared, perhaps even diluted, by the growing independence of mortal societies. How could he maintain his influence in a world where mortals no longer relied on divine will for their success or failure? This wasn't just a challenge for Zeus, it was a challenge for all the gods. For centuries, they had ruled over the mortal realm with authority, intervening at will, guiding heroes, punishing wrongdoers, and rewarding those who pleased them. They had been the ultimate arbiters of fate. But with mortals learning to govern themselves, to think for themselves, and to shape their own lives, the gods found themselves in a world where their interference wasn't always needed or welcomed. Hera, goddess of marriage and family, had always been seen as the protector of relationships and the enforcer of the sacred laws of family life. But with the gods gone, mortals had formed their own understanding of family and relationships. They had developed their own social systems, their own ideas about marriage, love, and familial bonds. Hera, who had long been the figure to guide mortals in matters of the heart, found herself in a position where her authority was no longer absolute. Mortals had learned to navigate these areas of life without relying on her divine presence, and although Hera's influence remained, it was no longer the defining force it once was. The same was true for gods like Apollo, Athena, and Poseidon. Apollo, god of music, prophecy, and healing, had once been the inspiration for artists and healers. But when the gods were absent, mortals found their own creative wellsprings. They no longer waited for Apollo's blessings to create art, music, or healing practices. The absence of divine intervention had allowed the mortals to explore their own potential, and now Apollo's role was more about inspiration than control. He still had the power to influence the arts and healing, but it wasn't the same as it had been. Athena, goddess of wisdom and strategy, had long been revered for her guidance in times of war and peace. She had provided wisdom to the greatest heroes, guiding them through the challenges they faced. But in the absence of the gods, mortals had learned to think for themselves. They had developed new philosophies, new ways of understanding the world, and new strategies for solving problems. Athena's wisdom was still valued, but it was no longer the singular source of knowledge. Mortals had realized that they, too, could be wise, that they, too, could create knowledge through their own efforts. Poseidon, god of the sea, had been a protector of sailors and a ruler of the waters. But just like Apollo and Athena, his domain had been challenged by the absence of divine influence. Mortals had learned to navigate the seas, to predict the weather, and to sail across vast distances without the constant need for Poseidon's favor. The seas were still dangerous, of course, but mortals had learned to survive them through their own innovation and skill. Poseidon's role had been diminished, but his influence remained a reminder of the forces of nature that mortals could never fully control. In the end, the gods had to adapt to a new world, one in which mortals had discovered their own power. They were no longer seen as the ultimate source of wisdom, strength, or protection. Mortals had learned to take control of their own lives, and while the gods still held power, their influence was no longer as absolute as it once was. This wasn't necessarily a bad thing for the gods, but it was a realization that their role in the world had shifted. For some gods, like Athena and Apollo, the shift was perhaps more welcome. They had always believed in the potential of mortals to grow and learn. They had always encouraged humans to think for themselves, to use their intellect and creativity to navigate the world. But for others, like Zeus and Hera, the gods' return represented a challenge to their long-established roles. The divine order had been altered, and they had to find a way to coexist with mortals who no longer saw them as the ultimate arbiters of fate. And yet, despite all of this, the gods' return didn't mean the end of the mortals' independence. Mortals still turned to the gods in times of crisis, still honored them in rituals and sacrifices, and still sought their blessings for important events. But the gods were no longer the central figures that guided every aspect of mortal life. Mortals had learned to stand on their own, and the gods, while still important, had become just one part of the larger tapestry of existence. Historians still debate whether the gods' return was a positive or negative shift. Some argue that it was necessary to restore divine order, while others suggest that it marked the beginning of the gods' gradual decline in importance. But regardless of how one views the gods' return, it's clear that mortals had learned something vital in their absence. They had learned that they could shape their own destinies, that they could take control of their own fates without relying on the gods. The gods' return marked a beginning of a new era, a world where mortals could still honor the gods, but where they no longer saw themselves as entirely dependent on divine favor. The gods had their roles, but mortals had discovered their own power. This world, where divine and mortal influence intermingled, was one of both respect and self-reliance, a delicate balance between the old order and the new. The gods had returned, but they were no longer the rulers of everything. They were simply part of the grand tapestry of existence, a reminder of a time when they held sway, but no longer the driving force of the mortal world. The gods returned to Olympus, as grand and resplendent as it was, could not undo the profound transformation that had taken place during their absence. Mortals had discovered something crucial about themselves. They had realized their own power, their own ability to shape their lives, and to govern their futures. While the gods had once been seen as the ultimate authority, they now had to share their power with a world that no longer depended on them in the same way. The gods' influence remained, but the mortals had become less afraid of the unknown, less reliant on divine intervention, and more capable of charting their own course. For the gods, this shift in the mortal world likely presented a challenge. In their absence, they had seen that mortals were capable of greatness without them. They had learned to fight their own battles, to find their own wisdom, and to create their own art and culture. It was no longer enough for the gods to simply intervene when things went wrong. Mortals had learned that they could face the trials of life without waiting for divine favor. The gods' role, while still important, was no longer central to the lives of mortals in the way it had once been. Zeus, for instance, was not only the ruler of the gods, but also the ultimate judge of mortals. He had been the one who decided the fate of cities and nations, who had cast down thunderbolts on those who defied the gods. But now, as Zeus returned to find a world where mortals governed themselves, his once absolute power had been softened. Mortals still respected him, still offered sacrifices to him, but they no longer feared him in the same way. The balance of power had shifted. Mortals had learned that their actions and decisions were just as powerful as any divine intervention. Take Athena, goddess of wisdom and strategy, as another example. Athena had long been the goddess who provided guidance to heroes, offering them the knowledge they needed to succeed. Yet, during the gods' absence, mortals had found their own wisdom. Philosophers like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle had developed new ways of thinking about the world, focused on logic, reason, and human potential. Mortals no longer waited for Athena's divine wisdom. They had learned to think for themselves, and this intellectual independence was a direct result of the gods' time away. Athena, ever the patron of wisdom, had to accept that mortals were no longer as reliant on her for their intellectual pursuits. Even gods like Apollo, who had once been the patron of the arts and prophecy, found themselves in a new role. Apollo had inspired poets, musicians, and orators, guiding their creativity and artistic expression. But in the absence of divine guidance, mortals had started to express themselves in new ways. Art and music flourished, not because Apollo dictated it, but because mortals had found their own inspiration. Apollo, while still honored, no longer held the same sway over the artistic world. Mortals had learned to create on their own, and the gods had to share their influence with these new, independent expressions of creativity. The same was true for Poseidon, the god of the sea. Sailors, once wholly dependent on Poseidon's favor for safe travels, had learned to navigate the oceans on their own. They had developed better ships, better navigation techniques, and a deeper understanding of the seas. While Poseidon was still the god of the oceans, his role had changed. Mortals now saw the sea not just as an unpredictable force ruled by a god, but as a challenge to be met with their own skill and knowledge. And yet, despite all of this, the gods still had a presence in the mortal world. They were still revered, still honored in rituals and sacrifices, and still called upon in times of crisis. But they no longer had the same absolute control over mortal affairs. The mortals had learned to govern themselves, to create their own futures, and to make their own decisions. The gods, for all their power, could no longer dictate the course of mortal lives in the way they once had. This was a dramatic shift, not just in the mortal world, but in the relationship between the gods and mortals themselves. In a sense, the gods' return marked the end of an era, a time when the gods were seen as the ultimate forces guiding the world. But it also marked the beginning of a new era, where the gods and mortals could coexist in a more balanced, nuanced way. The gods still had their roles, their domains, and their divine influence, but mortals had learned to stand on their own. They no longer needed divine favor for everything. They could shape their own destinies. This new world, where divine and mortal realms intersected but did not dominate each other, was one of both respect and independence. The gods had returned, but they could no longer claim the same absolute power over mortals. Mortals had learned to navigate the world, to think for themselves, and to rely on their own abilities. The gods, while still revered and still powerful, now had to share the stage with the very mortals they had once ruled over. Historians continue to ponder the significance of this shift. Was it the gods' absence that allowed mortals to discover their own potential, or was it the natural evolution of the human spirit that led them to realize their independence? Perhaps it was a combination of both. Regardless, what is certain is that the gods' return did not mark a return to the old order. Instead, it marked the beginning of a new relationship between gods and mortals, a relationship defined by mutual respect, acknowledgement of each other's power, and recognition of the complex interplay between divine and mortal will. As you drift off tonight, think of this new world, a world where the gods still watch over the mortals, but where mortals now carry the torch of their own fate. It's a world of balance, of self-reliance, and of divine presence that no longer dominates, but exists alongside mortal lives, as a gentle guide and protector. As the gods resumed their roles on Olympus, a curious thing happened in the mortal world. The divine return did not simply restore the old order. It fostered a world where divine influence and mortal agency could coexist. Mortals were no longer dependent on the gods for every decision, every fate, or every challenge. They had tasted the freedom of independence, and they would never again look at their gods in quite the same way. There was a delicate balance now between the divine and the mortal, a dance of respect and mutual acknowledgement. Zeus, the king of the gods, once ruled with absolute power, his thunderbolts an emblem of unquestioned authority. He had been the divine arbitrator, the ultimate judge of mortal behavior. But, as he returned to his throne, Zeus was confronted with a world that had evolved during his absence. Mortals no longer looked to him for answers to every question or for intervention in their daily lives. The gods' return to power was no longer about control. It was about finding a place within a world where mortals had learned to stand on their own. Zeus must have been deeply aware of the change. His power had always been something to fear and revere, but now it was tempered by the knowledge that mortals had grown stronger. They had learned, by trial and error, that their own will could shape their destinies, and that no thunderbolt, no divine edict, could change their course unless they allowed it. The gods, even Zeus, had to adapt to a world where their power was no longer the ultimate determining force in mortal lives. Hera, the goddess of marriage and family, also faced the shift in power. She had once been the enforcer of the sacred bonds between mortals, making sure that marriages were honored and families were protected. But after the gods' break, mortals had come to their own conclusions about relationships. They had created new understandings of family, love, and loyalty that didn't necessarily align with Hera's divine rules. Hera's role, while still revered, had diminished in importance. She was no longer the sole authority and had constituted a successful marriage or family life. Mortals had learned that these things were not solely dictated by the gods. They were part of the human experience, shaped by individual choices, culture, and society. Even gods like Apollo, who had once been seen as the ultimate inspiration for the arts, found their influence slipping. Apollo had been the god of music, poetry, and prophecy, revered for his ability to inspire greatness in mortals. But without his constant guidance, mortals had learned to create art and music on their own. They had discovered that creativity didn't come solely from divine favor. It was something intrinsic to their own human nature. Apollo's role was now one of inspiration, but it was no longer the source of all artistic achievement. Mortals had learned to find their own muse. Poseidon, god of the seas, also found his influence diminished. Sailors had always turned to Poseidon for safe voyages, offering sacrifices and prayers before embarking on long journeys. But when the gods were on break, mortals had learned to navigate the seas on their own. They had created better ships, better navigation techniques, and a deeper understanding of the oceans. Poseidon still held sway over the waters, but his influence was now more symbolic than absolute. Mortals could sail the seas without waiting for divine favor. They could do it on their own. In this new world, the gods were no longer the rulers they had once been. They were still revered, still called upon in times of need, but their influence had changed. They no longer had the same absolute power over mortals. The gods had learned that they had to coexist with mortals who had gained the knowledge and the confidence to govern their own lives. Mortals, once completely dependent on divine guidance, had learned to rely on themselves, and the gods had to come to terms with that shift. This new balance between gods and mortals wasn't about the gods giving up their power. It was about recognizing that mortals were capable of more than they had ever been credited with. The gods had always been seen as the ultimate authority, but in the absence of their constant intervention, mortals had discovered their own agency. The gods, while still essential in many ways, now shared the stage with mortals who had learned to navigate life without their help. Historians continue to debate whether the gods' return was a return to the old divine order or a reflection of a more complex, nuanced relationship between gods and mortals. Some argue that the return of the gods marked the restoration of divine authority, while others believe that it signaled a shift in the role of the gods, one in which they were no longer the sole determinants of mortal life. Either way, one thing is clear: the gods' return did not mean a return to the old world. Mortals had learned to stand on their own, and that knowledge could never be undone. As you drift into sleep tonight, consider how the return of the gods shaped the mortal world. The gods may have resumed their positions on Olympus, but the mortals were no longer the same. They had learned to rely on their own strength, their own intellect, and their own creativity. The gods' return was not the restoration of divine dominance. It was a recognition that the mortal world had changed. The balance had shifted, and the gods, though still revered, now shared the world with mortals who had learned to shape their own destinies. As the gods finally settled back into their roles on Olympus, it was clear that their return was not a simple return to the old world. The mortals had evolved, had grown stronger, and now viewed the gods with a complex mix of respect, reverence, and newfound independence. The gods, while still powerful, had to accept that their reign over mortal lives had been reshaped. Mortals had learned to live without divine interference, and the return of the gods only reinforced the changes that had already taken root. The gods could no longer claim the same absolute authority they once had. Zeus, once the undisputed ruler of both gods and mortals, had to acknowledge that the power he wielded was no longer enough to command complete control over the mortal world. Mortals had learned to take charge of their own fates, to make decisions that didn't require divine intervention. And in that recognition, Zeus' return became less about asserting dominance and more about finding his place in a world where mortals no longer saw him as the sole arbiter of their destiny. Zeus' power, though vast, had been diluted. He had always been the god of order, the one who maintained the balance of the universe, but in the absence of divine control, mortals had found their own ways to create order. They had established governments, laws, and systems of justice that didn't rely on divine fiat. They had learned to make their own decisions, to create their own societies, and to govern their own lives. Zeus, while still a powerful figure, had to share the world with those who no longer needed him to decide their fate. Hera, the goddess of marriage and family, also had to accept this new reality. While mortals still honored her for her role as the protector of families, they had also created their own moral frameworks. The divine guidance that Hera once provided in matters of marriage and family had given way to more human-centered understandings of these concepts. Mortals no longer looked to Hera to define what was sacred. They had learned to define those things for themselves. In this new world, the gods were no longer the central figures in mortal life. Their roles were important, but their influence had become one part of a much larger system. Mortals had learned to shape their own lives, and while the gods continued to provide their blessings, they no longer controlled every aspect of the human experience. The gods, though revered, had to learn how to coexist with mortals who had discovered their own power. Apollo, once the patron of the arts, now found himself in a world where mortals no longer depended on him for creative inspiration. Artists, musicians, and poets no longer waited for his divine influence to guide them. They had learned to create on their own. Apollo's role as the god of music and poetry was no longer central to the creative process. Mortals had discovered that their own creativity could flourish without divine intervention. Similarly, Poseidon, god of the seas, had to come to terms with the fact that mortals had learned to navigate the oceans without his favor. Sailors no longer prayed to him for safe voyages. They relied on their own knowledge, skill, and experience to guide them through the waters. Poseidon's role had changed from a protector of sailors to a reminder of the power of the sea, but the mortals no longer depended on him for their survival. This shift was not just about diminishing the gods' power. It was about recognizing the strength of mortals. The gods had always been seen as the ones who shaped the world, but now the mortals had learned to shape their own destinies. They had learned that their own strength, intellect, and creativity were enough to overcome the challenges they faced. The gods, while still important, had become part of the background of mortal life, no longer the central force they had once been. The mortals' newfound independence wasn't a rejection of the gods. It was a recognition of their own worth. They had learned to stand on their own, to solve their own problems, and to create their own futures. The gods, while still revered, were no longer the sole masters of fate. The mortals had learned that they could achieve greatness without divine intervention. As you settle in tonight, imagine a world where the gods return to their thrones, but the mortals stand taller than ever before. The gods may have once ruled with absolute power, but now they share the stage with mortals who have learned to shape their own destinies. The world they return to, one where the gods still play a role, but where mortals hold the power to create their own fate. In this world, the divine is a guiding force, but the real power lies with the mortals who have learned to govern themselves. And in that realization, the world is forever changed. The gods' return may have been a return to order, but it was also a reminder of how much had been gained in their absence. Mortals had learned to think for themselves, to create, and to govern. The divine had its place, but the mortals were no longer bound by it. And in that shift, the world became a place where both the divine and the mortal could coexist, each respecting the other's power. Good night.